That's the only value that the slave has to the master. And
Correct.
the same way, he would think about a donkey, right? That is an outcome that is interrupted if the master were to treat his slave agapically.
There's something very disturbing in what you just said, which is you seem to have a very anti-donkey bias in your heart.
It almost disturbs me that we have this conflict of opinion about what agape means, right? Because I kind of take your interpretation of it as just being incredibly despairing and dark.
All right, man. Welcome. This has been a long time coming. I think for the holidays and everything else, work, and we've taken a bit of a break and been branching out into other things. But
it's lecture 16. It's I think one of those lectures that Vervaeke has commented on before, as well as being a very impactful lecture. A lot of people who are in the Christian tradition have listened to this lecture and have really taken a lot out of it. And Vervaeke's talked about how many people have given him feedback on this lecture, and I can understand why. I've been gestating on this agape concept and lecture for quite a while, and I think it took a while for me to even sort of process some of the ideas behind it as well. And so I'm actually looking forward to see, what your perspective is on this. I suspect we may have very divergent takeaways from this.
Oh yeah, okay,
this lecture.
maybe.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think we may, but we'll see where it goes. Okay, so.
Sure.
I'm going to, as always, do the summary.
The opportunity to disagree with you is always exciting.
Yeah,
so I'm extra.
There's a
now I'm extra
sacredness
excited.
just there, just in the disagreement, right?
Yeah.
It's a sacred experience for you.
Yeah.
Before I get into the actual summary, I just want to caveat by saying that this is what I would call an interpretive summary. I'm not just doing a blow-by-blow of the different paragraphs and the content of the lecture, but I sort of took it as a whole, and I spoke to what really resonated with me in this lecture and what I think is the most important stuff. Of course, that's completely subjective. You may have a different take, but anyone listening to the summary is not going to get an entire perfect blow-by-blow of the lecture, but it does obviously cover the main themes here. So let's get started without further ado.
Sure.
So the lecture dives into the concept of agape, which is a kind of love. Now, the Greeks had several words for love, and it's actually kind of telling that we don't anymore, but the Greeks had several words for them. Agape was one of them. But another kind of love was eros, which refers to a consumptive kind of love. So loving sex or food or drink is this kind of love. The second kind of love is philia, which is a love of friendship and of love of cooperation. So you love a friend, not because you want to consume them, but because they add to your life and you add to their life. And so that's a kind of love which is called philia. And then, of course, you have agape. Agape is neither eros, it's not philia either. Agape refers to pure, unconditional love that requires nothing from the individual who is being loved. The person is loved with agape as they are, even if they're not useful to you or even if they don't help you in some way. So the example that we can most readily relate to as an example of agapic love is the love that a mother will have for her child. This is obviously not erotic in nature. This is neither the love of friendship or cooperation. It is pure, unadulterated, and unconditional love. Now, this is the kind of love that Jesus was teaching to his followers. The idea is that if we treated all of our fellow humans with agapic love, that would cause, according to Jesus and Paul, a radical transformation of not just yourself, but potentially also the people who are receiving your agapic love. Now, this is not a matter of propositional philosophy, but a matter of participatory knowing. You can only get there if you actually adopted and practiced the call of agape. Now, we could easily in our modern day conjure up psychological theories for why approaching other humans with agapic love is beneficial. We could say that it neutralizes prejudice, resentment, hate, anger, and all of these things boost our mental well-being, and then you could argue that this is great for society. We could say that this is a clever cognitive hack, and it has beneficial side effects. But the claim of agape's power actually extends much further than just mere psychological mind tricks. The most astonishing claim to me, at least, of the power of agape is the argument that receiving agapic love from others is what transforms you from a non-person to an actual person. So at face value, this seems to be a bit of an esoteric and obtuse point. I struggle with this point quite a bit. And so I really try to figure out how to wrap my mind around it, right? And so this is my approach. I think the first principle that we need to accept in order to understand this point about turning non-persons into persons is that our self-perception, our self-regard as self-worth is molded entirely by the way that others treat and regard us. Our self-worth isn't really based on our abilities or strengths. If they were, then our self-worth would stand on very shaky grounds, because one day we might lose those abilities because we got sick or we got old. Then our sense of self-worth and self-regard will dissipate accordingly. If people only love me because I am clever or rich or skilled at something that society regards as important, then my self-worth holds up only in as much as I remain performant in those areas. And this is probably why celebrities are so insecure, right? They receive massive amounts of adulation and love, but they know that they're only a couple of flops away from losing all of that love. So if a celebrity doesn't have a sense of self-worth and self-regard that comes from outside of those contingencies, their career, then tremendous issues with self-esteem and self-worth and even self-love come up. Why would you love yourself if no one else does? If your performance was the only basis for other people's love, then you're basically having to hustle your entire life to be deserving of that love, right? Not so if you are loved agapically. With agapic love, you are loved irrespective of what you are able to bring into my life or to society. If one is loved agapically, what is being said is that you matter simply because you are. You don't have to do anything further to be deserving of that love. You need not be clever or useful or beautiful or anything else. You are loved and you are therefore worthy as a human of love just because you are human. And this then goes to a very profound question of what it even means to be a person, a human. If you are loved or you are seen just as you are and not because of what others can get out of you, if your worth is not tied to your attributes or your ability to contribute to society, then what is being loved is you. Your personhood is being loved. Your personhood is being acknowledged in a very real way. Your personhood is actualized by the agapic love that others give you. And in a sense, you are turned from a non-person to a person. And in this way, agapic love has the power and force of creation. It has the power and force of God. Agape is God, for without it, I am just a biological machine, defined not by my personhood, but my function or usefulness to others. So I've also kind of skipped over the story of Saul or Paul over here, through which a lot of agape is explained, and I'll just refer the listener to the actual lecture, which is a must listen. But one thing that I want to highlight about the story of Paul, which I think is really important for us to talk about, is the inner conflict that he had after he followed the way, right? So Paul was a Roman who was deeply connected to the idea of law and of judgment and punishment of those who upset the social order. But then here you've got agape, right? And so how and why can a criminal be punished if they are meant to treat each other agapically, right? Vervaeke argues, though, that this inner conflict became mythologized in Jesus' crucifixion. God himself, Paul taught, had this conflict between judgment and agape. And the conflict was resolved by letting Jesus take the punishment for the rest of us by being crucified. And this is why Christians will say that Jesus died for our sins, right? The judgment was placed on Jesus' shoulders so that we didn't have to bear that burden. Now, the balance and conflict between agape and judgment was restored there with the crucifixion. But if you sort of leave the mythology aside for a moment, because you may not buy into the mythology, I don't buy into the mythology, for example, this conflict between judgment and agape is still present when you consider the subject today, right? So from a practical perspective, the question is, how do you move forward in a world in the world agapically at the same time not falling prey to a society or a system or even an individual that might choose to exploit the agape as weakness, right? And that's, for me, that's kind of where the conflict sort of lies, in my opinion. So again, really skipped and chopped off a lot of the lecture. I wanted to sort of focus on what I thought were the most fundamental ideas of the lecture. It's what I call an interpretive summary, but that sort of wraps it up actually as a summary. Your thoughts?
Yeah. I certainly think that is a prominent theme that people are struggling with. I also think, I guess I can be a little bit of an asshole here, but like, I also think the answer is a bit obvious, right? And that's part of the weird thing to me, is that we have the model in front of us, which is the love that a parent has for their child, right? And there's a couple of aspects to that that are not, and that are affecting parenting because they're taken the wrong way. Is a parent, a truly loving parent, does discipline their child, does set boundaries and limits, and does not accept all behavior. Being agapically loving does not mean universal acceptance of behavior, right? It may mean love for the person, but part of love for the person is to reject behaviors that are unacceptable, right? That is an essential aspect of agapic love, in fact, right? And I think we see that also even in the mythologies of Jesus in the Bible, right? The scene where he comes into the marketplace to find the moneylenders and in the temple and whips them out of the temple, right? It is a violent action. He forcibly removes them, right? I mean, one of the classic, funny quotes, I think that funny because it's not in our mental model typically, right? Is in the Bible, Jesus says, "Think not I am come to earth to bring peace but a sword," right? And because we've lost the full context of Christianity, or even the Bible in some sense, these verses are glossed over, right? And if you are going to love agapically, that may involve whipping the person out of the marketplace, right? Like, and saying this behavior is unacceptable. And that is also a part of agapic love. And I think once you realize that, once you think about a parent truly loving their child and saying, I want what is best for you, I want you to become a person. Well, becoming a person means understanding moral boundaries, understanding social boundaries, understanding both the mores and the morals of the culture that we're in, right? And so I think we're only confused because we have lost the original frame that we know is the best model, is a parent love for child. Like that was the model, right? That's why the father-son motif is so present in Christianity. But within that, somehow we've lost it. I mean, I think I see that also in therapy, for instance, right? Like Rogers, I don't know how much you know about Rogers, but Rogers was a therapist who came up with this idea of that the essential prerequisite for therapy is unconditional positive regard, right? Is that you regard the and it's agapic, right? In its essence, but the original Rogerian version was not, oh, I'll accept any behavior. It was unconditional positive regard while also saying, no, that behavior is unacceptable. No, that viewpoint is unacceptable. That idea is no, you can't be a sociopath wandering around. And I'm like agapically like, oh, yes, that's great. Like, that's not agape, right? Because that is not helping that person become a person. That is not... It's interesting. Universal love or unconditional love or agapic love in that sense is almost antithetical to universal acceptance. Like,
is it?
Yeah, I think
don't know
so
that
because
it's antithetical. Explain.
If you truly love a child, right? It would be remarkably unloving to allow their problematic behaviors to persist without correction, right? Similarly, if you have agapic love for another person, it would be unloving to tell them, "Oh yeah, that's okay," when it's not. When what they're doing is not okay, you're setting them up for failure. How can that be loving? Like, how could it be loving to set someone up to fail?
I understand the point you're making. I do feel like it it runs into a pretty significant danger, right? Which is that you could claim to have agapic love in your heart for your fellow man, and then stand in judgment of them at every single turn, and prescribe severe punishments. I mean, you could even argue that perhaps the entire Inquisition was about agape love, right? Is like, I mean, the reason they would torture the heretics, before they recanted, is to wash them of their sins, right? So they don't have to suffer in hell. So we are torturing you because we love you so much, right? So you could understand how, when judgment walks side by side with agapic love, you could say that you have agape and still do incredibly heinous stuff, right? So the entire the entire sort of essence of agape really just becomes distorted if there's constant judgment. And I'll give you an example of this. Like, he talked about this in a lecture. When Saul, went to, I think he was going to Damascus or something, to go ahead and kill and persecute the Christians, he lost his sight, or he had the sort of enlightenment experience when he met Jesus in the desert, and he lost his vision. And then the people he was about to persecute actually found him and nursed him back to health, right? Now, if those people, those Christians who nursed him back to health were thinking, yes, we love you agapically, but in order to continue to nurture our Christian faith, so that we can spread agape to even more people, we have to stand in judgment and we have to execute you. Forget about nursing you to health. We have to execute, because that's what the judgment prescribes for what you're doing, right?
Well,
so how do you square those things?
You're taking it in a different, like, you don't execute a child. Like, oh, I'm sorry.
No. So the child,
you have attempted to put your finger into the outlet, and thus we will kill you off.
That's the wrong framework, because the example of the child's the example of the child's the love that a mother has for the child was just, this is the closest that we have in our common experience to understanding what it's like, right? And we should try to bring that energy to our fellow man as well. But one of the fundamental differences between raising a child agapically and treating a fellow man as agapically is that you don't think of your fellow man as an undeveloped character that doesn't know to, like, put their finger in a socket and requires to be judged harshly as a result of that, right? You're basically agapically loving your peers, and that's not a circumstance that's available to you when you're raising a 2-year-old, for example, right? They're not your peers.
And that's actually so we'll come back to that, I think, if you don't mind. But I actually think that's the bigger issue: is how can you love agapically without asserting yourself as being higher in a hierarchy of some kind? That's actually, I think, a bigger issue.
I mean, right? That's the conflict. But that's the essence of the conflict, right?
Sure.
It's another way of saying, how do you not judge at the same time as loving, which was the
you
conflict
can't, and that's my point. But you can't. I think the bigger issue is, rather than saying what does the law prescribe as the punishment itself, punishment, quote unquote, should reflect the agapic love. It is. What punishment will help you move forward in a better way to become a person? What punishment will help? Like, it's not punishment for vengeance. It's not punishment for the sake of satisfying my sense of being hurt, right? And making me feel better. The punishment for a child is essentially, you need to learn this lesson. This is a mistake, right? Now, when Jesus is doing that, presumably, like in the Christian faith, like, there's a perfection there that allows that. When God is doing that, then you can accept it, because there's your presumption is, I'm being corrected by someone with perfect knowledge, right? When another person does it, there's a bit of a challenge there. And I think there's something to work out where you have to say, okay, are you right, or do I agree with you? Do I agree that I have made a mistake? Right? Because if I don't agree, then, I mean, it's notable. He was taken in after he had the awakening. He didn't get taken in and then have the awakening, right? So at the moment he was taken in and received that agapic love, he had transformed to be open to the notion that I have made a mistake, right? So there is a prerequisite there. Because if we're so far apart on what we even consider right and wrong, then I cannot provide you with, well, the best agape I can give you is to wish you well and send you on your way, right? Because no discussion is possible of how could you grow into a person, into a better person, a more person-y person.
Hold on a second. There you go. That you made a very important distinction there. How can I help you to grow into a person? And then you corrected and said better person, right? So there's that element of judgment there. And that kind of runs contrary to the entire notion of agape, which is unconditional and without judgment. That's the entire point of it, right? And that's kind of why Paul had this conflict. I mean, no, you may disagree whether or not that's appropriate or not, right? But what I'm contending is that is the teaching. The teaching is that it is unconditional, right? So a good example is the child may put his finger in the socket.
Then how did Jesus whip the money lenders out of the market? If there's no judgment there.
No. Again, the Bible is full of contradictions, right? And this particular lecture, as agape was being explained.
So how does a parent parent a child without judgment? I think these are absurd concepts.
I'm not saying no, but here's the thing: I am separating the two.
That is agapic love.
Right?
You cannot agapically love someone without judgment. That's an absurd idea, in my opinion.
And that's the conflict, right? This is why,
absolutely.
That's the conflict.
Absolutely. I think the notion of, first of all, unconditional love as it is currently understood, meaning including unconditional acceptance and judgmentless love, right, is deeply poisonous.
But that is agape, though. But this is agape.
No, it's not. No, it's not. That's my point, is that agape is the love of a parent for a child, the love of God for an undeveloped human, right? There is absolutely judgment in that. All the religions agree that there is judgment, including Christianity, right? Otherwise, there wouldn't be any issue. The notion that God judges you, otherwise Saul wouldn't have had a conflict. Right?
But that's the entire point of it, that the conflict exists, right? And then he sort of turned it into, he's dying for our sins, and therefore...
And Vervaeke himself says that is because of Paul's unresolved conflict.
Sure,
that these things are not conflictual, right? He misunderstood, in Vervaeke's view, and I agree with him, the nature of agapic love. Agapic love includes loving judgment. And he couldn't see that those are merged, and thus he had a conflict.
So, in other words, you could only love a person agapically, which by definition is this unconditional love, if it's conditioned on
not
certain
unconditional
judgments.
The love is not conditional. That's my point.
Okay. Let us then redefine it, because the core essence of my understanding of agape from this lecture was that it was truly unconditional, right? So if it's not eros and it's not philia, then what exactly, how would you then redefine agape? If we were, just get a definition on the table.
Yeah. So what I'm actually trying to make a separate distinction is that there is a distinction between love and acceptance. And that love does not, you can love someone without accepting them.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
If you have a brother that's a drug addict and is tearing, the most loving thing you can do maybe is to let him hit rock bottom, right? And say, no, I'm not going to help you anymore, right? That may in fact be the most loving thing you can do. And that's my point, is you're not accepting the behavior. You are unconditionally loving him. You do still love. The love is there because the love is the desire for him to become fully himself, to be his personhood, right? And the drug use is getting in the way. right? So the question is, how do I respond to this situation in a way that best promotes his personhood? And that is not accepting his current behavior set.
Sure. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's where I.
Yeah. No.
So
I
that's
don't.
what I'm saying is
Yeah.
I think in order to do that, you have to judge. You have to say, hey, I think
Sure.
this behavior is not promoting your personhood, right? And so there's a judgment there, but it is from a place. It is from the unconditional love that I want you to be your best version of yourself, right? And so from that place, that's where the judgment comes from, is you're doing something that's getting in the way of that. So that's why I think that these things are not, if you distinguish between love and acceptance, I think you can start to see that agape and judgment are not in conflict. In fact, one requires the other.
Again, but the problem with that, though, right, is that judgment can take you to some very dark places, right? Like, what if your judgment is wrong? Like, judgment ultimately is a matter of wisdom also.
Yep.
What if your wisdom is misplaced, right? What if, you decide in order to make sure your child thrives and does well, you beat them up all the time and you criticize them and you put a lot of pressure on it. You basically make their life miserable, and you could tell yourself that this is coming from agapic love. But at the end of the day, you have none of the features. None of the features are actually there, right?
Absolutely.
None
and
of the transformative effects would be there.
And that's why agapic love does not and this is actually a very great, exactly the point to me, is agapic love does not absolve you from the need for wisdom or avoiding self-delusion.
Totally agree with that.
In order to really give agapic love, you have to be very on point with your self-knowledge. Because exactly, you can totally deceive yourself into thinking you are acting agapically. You can use agape itself as a justification for projecting, as Saul did, right? For projecting your self-delusion into the world, right? And so it's not a like easy answer, like, oh, just be agapic and then you're fine. No. Maybe. Are you really being agapic here, or are you projecting your own needs and insecurities and calling it agape and using that as a justification? Right.
The reason that I have a problem with this, right? Say you take two scenarios of the brother that you mentioned, for example, that might be a drug addict, and you let them hit rock bottom because you feel like that's the best thing for them. If you were to take a person who approached that scenario with agape and judgment versus just judgment only, right? You would almost have no differences in behavior at all.
No,
right?
Maybe,
you would
maybe,
act
maybe
exactly
not.
the same way, right? So it's hard to know what agape is contributing to that scenario then.
Tone. There's a difference in tone, right? Just like a parent disciplining a child or a judge disciplining a criminal, those have different tones. And I think the tone matters, right? The notion here is that I'm doing, and by the way, at letting my brother hit rock bottom hurts me, right? And even that sense of I am hurt by having to do this creates a bond that transcends the moment. So it's not just, you can't separate the behavior from the tone, right? Like just saying, like, oh, I'm with my partner and I say, yeah, I love you. Like, okay, that's different than saying I love you in a different way, right? And similarly, the tone of how that's done is important.
Yeah,
because it's not. It's a gestalt, right? As we've talked about in other contexts in these lectures, it's not the features; it's the gestalt.
Yeah, I struggle with this, right? And again, I think part of this comes from my background of growing up in Muslim environments. That's where everything was judgment, right? It was. There's no agape. It was just the judgment part of it, right? Is that you have done this thing wrong, you have done that thing wrong. This
Sure.
is what you're supposed to do, and it's all judgment all the way down, right? And you could fool yourself into saying that somewhere along the whole series of judgments, there's actually agapic intent there,
Totally.
but you may not see it at all, right? It may not be manifest in any way whatsoever. You may go a lifetime knowing somebody without really sensing that there's any kind of agapic impulse behind their actions, right? And you would not know the difference. And so that just sort of makes it difficult to, it almost denudes it from its potential power, is that it's supposed to be not judgmental, right? Like no matter what happens, I still love you unconditionally. Now, I may, enjoin you to give up your drug addiction, or, do all the, be better as a human being in all of those other things. And in doing so, I'll have to stand in judgment of you. But you have to know that it's coming from a place of love and true acceptance and what have you. And maybe if,
Not necessarily acceptance, but love, yeah.
Well, I mean, acceptance of you as a person, not of your,
Sure.
your actions, right? Yeah, not of your, because this is the whole thing about personhood, right? That I was talking about, which I think is a profound sort of idea.
Yeah.
The whole thing about, how you judge a person and, whether, you should support them or like, encourage them to change. That's different, right? It's about the whole thing of like, you are a human being only because you are loved agapically and unconditionally. Now, the person giving you that love may want you to move your life in one direction versus another, but
so I think you're underselling. Like, okay, and I'm sensitive to what you're saying, in that like you're raised in a certain household, very strict. You didn't feel this whatever, but I think you're underestimating the degree to which the agapic impulse had power. You speak language. You are able to interface with society. You're able to follow moral. Those are all the result of the agapic intent behind those judgments. Because you were made into a functioning member of society by the agapic intent underneath that flawed implementation. Otherwise, you'd be a sociopath, or you'd be an animal, or you'd be an alinguistic, person like in the forest.
I think it's a little bit different. I think agapic love makes you into a person, and then judgment, within the context of your society and social mores, makes you a functional member of that society, right? And those are two different things. The first thing is to be a person, right? The reason I harp on this thing, and I think it's such a profound idea, right? Because now we've spent all this time talking about judgment, and I know that's your favorite subject, but the
Yeah.
it was the personhood idea that really struck me, right? And what kind of came to my mind was a couple of things, which is reminding myself of the environment that Jesus was preaching in that time, right? Which is an environment where you had a very severe sort of social stratification. You had the nobility. You had obviously the echelons of Roman society. You had the very poor people, and you had slaves, right? And you can definitely imagine, like, if you were a slave born in that environment, or an extremely poor person, just homeless or beggared, or widowed or whatever, or handicapped in some way, you had absolutely no worth at all as a human in that society, right? And so if someone like Jesus comes around and says, listen, you have nothing to contribute to society, you have nothing to give us, you only take and you don't give back, but none of that matters at all. You are still worthy as a human being and worthy of love, no matter what you do or what you're able to contribute. So the way that I understood, that you are worthy in despite, right, was I took it as, even if you can't, contribute positively to society in some socioeconomic way, that doesn't matter, right? You may be a slave, right? Or you may be disabled here in Roman times, or you may be the poorest person in Rome. Doesn't matter. Right? I still love you regardless, right? Which is a very different kind of way of thinking about the worth of a person back then compared to what Jesus was, prescribing, right? And I even see this in the modern world, right? So growing up in Pakistan, there's a lot of child beggars there, right? You go to some of the cities over there, you go to some, marketplace, you will literally see people, children, obviously less than 10 years of age, like they're not teenagers, who are deployed by these sort of gangs to like go around, begging in the streets, and they're downtrodden, they're obviously hungry, they're obviously uneducated, and all they do is they sort of just beg on the streets, right? And I see how society treats them, right? Like they're not even there. Like, and then once you told me, homeless people, even in the Western world, when they're panhandling on the streets, for example, right? One of the things that really bothers them the most is that people won't even make eye contact with them, right? They won't even see them, right?
Yep.
And in a very real way, agapic love is a cure for those kind of situations, right? For people living in those realities, right? Is that, that beggar on the street, forget about what he does with, whether he pays taxes or whether he helps old ladies cross the street or whatever his moral character is. All of that comes after the fact of acknowledging them as a human being first. Because they're all people, who may have been born and raised without feeling any kind of agapic love from anyone at all, right? Whether because you were born in an orphanage or you were born with some disability in an incredibly poor socioeconomic situation where society just did not give you any sort of self-worth at all, right? Because you were not useful to society in any particular way at all. So you were just almost like you didn't exist. You were a non-person. Then Jesus comes along and says, none of that matters. What you can contribute to society doesn't matter at all. Just because you exist, I love you. And that makes you worthy. Right. And that, I think, is a really powerful message. Right. And that's sort of where I spent a lot of time thinking about. Right. And unsurprisingly, you went straight to the judgment part of it.
I'm not sure that I took us there, but
what do you think of that take? That was how I sort of understood agape, as opposed to trying to integrate it with judgment. Because, you seem to have a solution to how to integrate it with judgment, which is like, no, you judge, right? And I kind of think that, yes, you can integrate it that way, but then you are going to run into problems right off the bat, or not. You're going to run into difficulties, right?
Yeah, absolutely. You run into difficulties.
Perhaps
this
surmountable.
Is not and that's my point. It's not an easy path. It's not a path that absolves you from the risk, the dukkha, the risk of self-delusion, right? Yeah. You don't escape that by being agapic. On the contrary, it doubles down as saying, okay, my ability to love and contribute to this person, I have to be even more on point, because now I'm engaging in a relationship in such a profound way that my errors are going to be projected. So the need for self-awareness, self-knowledge becomes, you double down on. I mean, like, again, I just think that, like, yes, I think seeing someone as a person is maybe a first step of agape. It's the first. It's a prerequisite, right? But it is not itself the thing that does the transformation, right? The thing that does the transformation requires that, but it's also to say, hey, let's talk together about life, let's engage, right? Like with the child, like a lot of what makes them into persons is engagement. It's not even directed engagement. It's just the engagement there, right? And so, but it's the engagement. A child can't develop empathy if you never express that you've been hurt by them, right? Mm. So if you, again, similarly, like if you have infinite, patience, and you never, like, whatever, you can never teach them limits, because you never, like, part of how a child develops empathy, develops awareness, develops kindness, develops all these things is by perceiving, like, oh, that annoyed mom, I need to not do that. Mm-hmm. I've been rebuked out of mom's impatience and annoyance. Like, no, don't, like, ow, that hurt, or, oh, like, that's annoying, don't do that. Jordan Peterson famously, right? Like, don't let your kids do anything that makes you dislike them, right? Mm. But the intent there is, that is the thing that makes them persons. Because otherwise they have no feedback. and they
No,
cannot
no, no, no.
develop
So,
without feedback.
this is where I disagree. I think we're saying slightly different things. So I'm saying that what makes a person, what Jesus was teaching with agape, is that the love itself makes them persons, right? And I think you're extending that and saying that no, no, no. It's the act of discipline and judgment that makes them good persons, right? So you are extending that further and conflating just personhood with good personhood, right? Is that, and Jesus was saying, no, you are just a person. You are worthy of being loved. Now, whether or not you become a good person, that's a completely separate conversation, right?
So let's talk about I mean, actually, I think that the reason maybe we're also at odds to some degree, we haven't defined what we mean by being a person. What does it mean to be a person, right? And one of the ways I would start my perception is I think it's not binary, right? I don't think it's a yes no, you're a person, you're not a person. I think it's a continuum of personhood, from sort of maybe an infant's level of like a constellation of instinct and potential, right? Up to maybe an idealized, self-actualized version of you being the most Atif you can be, right? So to be fully yourself, right? And so for me, I think becoming a person is not a binary, it is a progression along that continuum. Right? And that is why I think that judgment's an inherent part of that, because is what you're doing progressing you along that axis or non-progressing you along that axis? Right? If I'm teaching a child language, I think it's difficult to imagine a child becoming as much of a person or as fully actualized as they could be if they never learn English, or meaning any language. They never learn to interact because they're kept in a closet, right? And I love them agapically from afar. I'm like, well, it's a person. That person is kept in a closet, right? And so merely recognizing personhood doesn't do anything. It is the actions that come out of recognizing personhood or the potential for personhood. And I would argue that in many ways, and again, I think the language Vervaeke uses is very clear, is agape transforms non-persons into persons, and it's not just the moment, right? It's the way you love a child. A child over years moves from a non-person into a person through the extended experience of an investment in them, an investment, the forgiving, the undeserved giving of language, interaction, connection, information, all the things that are conveyed in an interaction, right?
I don't think that's what he was getting at, like the unconditional giving of language, and I assume you're talking about morality and character and all of those things as well, and that's what's defining us as a person. Again, I think you're conflating just raw personhood with being a good person, right? I think these are separate.
Again, what's your definition of personhood then? I mean, I gave mine.
So I kind of incorporated it into the summary as well, right? And it was difficult to sort of like, this was the hardest part for me to wrap my brain about. What does he even mean, right? And I kind of boiled it down to thinking about what it would be like, right? Just to have what would the consciousness of a person who was born in an orphanage, abandoned by their parents, raised by incredibly bureaucratic, workers in some orphanage, kicked out when they were 16 years old, released into the streets, never in that person's life had anybody who really loved them agapically in any way at all. How would that person think about themselves? Right? How would they regard their own sense of self-worth, their own sense of whether or not they're worthy as a human, right? And my impression is that it would be extremely low, right? They would not even think of themselves as, worthy enough to like speak to someone at a higher sort of social hierarchy than them, right? Because they were just the lowest of the low, right? And, the reason I think that's the correct kind of explanation is Jesus' teaching spoke mostly to the poorest of the poor, the slaves and the beggars, right? Is who he spoke to. Now, the message didn't resonate with them because they're like, yes, this is the road to character. If we love each other agapically, then I will become better in these ethical domains, right? That was not, I think, the attraction. The attraction was like Jesus was going to all of these people who were basically non-humans, right, in Roman society. I mean, slaves were literally considered non-humans, right, to some extent in Roman society, and telling that, no, you are fully human, you are a person. And the way that happens is that I just give you my love and treat you with love unconditionally, right? And then the task of, whether you're a good person or not a good person is a different question altogether. And so that's why I think your interpretation is not entirely accurate, right?
So again, I think you're if I'm understanding you correctly, I think you are defining personhood very closely with the notion of just being seen.
Yeah,
like
I am
right,
100%.
Yeah, and and that's where we disagree. Is we're defining personhood differently, right? Like, I think it is entirely possible to see someone. I don't think the slaves were unseen in that sense, right? Their masters were seeing them as they were beating them, right? You are noticed. But the masters. Hang on, let me finish.
The masters were seeing.
Let me finish. The master is seeing the slave in terms of what the slave can do for them. Mm-hmm. They're seeing them erotically in that sense, right? Yeah. So it's not just being seen. That's my point. There's more to it. It's being seen as worthy of investment. No, and that's my point. Is what it means to be as a person is worthy of what? Worthy in what way? You say worthy, but worthy of what? And my point is worthy of investment, right? Worthy of investment in progression along your own self-development. That, like, worthy is not it's worthy of what? And that's why I think your definition's incomplete, is because you stop at the word worthy. And you haven't specified worthy of what?
Worthy of love, worthy of being loved, right? Knowing that you are loved. I mean, so another angle.
So then, what is love?
I think that's what sort of self. I mean, it's. I don't know. I think I'm not really sure how to answer that.
That's my point. Is my answer for that is. Love is in a very powerful way valuing the other person's self, the other person's progress toward their ideal self. The notion, even if you're loving them only as potential, but loving someone's potential even is loving the notion that they can progress toward an ideal.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, this understanding. I mean, so let's just get back to the slave example. Like, the master sees the slave, right, as they're beating them, right? So that's not what's meant by seen, because the master also sees a tree, also sees a rock, and also sees this donkey, right? Totally. These things are also seen, right? But the whole thing of it is that if the donkey, the tree, and the house and the slave are all sort of the same part of the master's like outlook, right? Like, oh, these are all equal. There's a difference between the tree and the donkey and the slave. They're all sort of the same non-human entities, right? And I will treat them accordingly to try to extract productivity out of them. So, beating the slave to get more productivity is not being seen, right? Because it's not their humanness that's being seen. They're not being regarded positively in any way outside of their ability to contribute to the slaves.
That's so I agreed with the first part, and then you said positivity, and that's where we disagree. I agree the issue is they're not seeing their humanness. It has nothing to do with positivity, my opinion.
No. So, let me finish the thing. They are not being viewed in any kind of way other than what they can contribute to their master, right? That's the only value that the slave has to the master. And it ends and stops there, right?
Correct.
The same way, he would think about a donkey, right? And if the slave is only regarding himself as being useful to society, to his slave, to the world that he was brought up in as much as he can, do manual labor or be of service to his master, then as soon as that ends, the slave's own sense of worth, own sense of self, just vanishes, right? But that is that is an outcome that is interrupted if the master were to treat his slave agapically, for first and foremost.
Sure.
Right?
I mean, I agree with everything you've said. I think we disagree about what those words mean, right? And also, by the way, I think there's something very, disturbing we need to talk about in what you just said, which is you seem to have a very anti-donkey bias, and a very in your heart. I think you have a very sort of speciesist. Yeah.
No,
but
I this is it almost disturbs me that we have this conflict of opinion about what agape means, right? Because I kind of take your interpretation of it as just being incredibly despairing and dark because it's conditional, right? It is. It's conditional. It's almost seems so. So here's the thing: your definition, right? If you take it to some conclusion, right, would result in the Inquisition, would it not? I mean, it is completely philosophically sound to torture somebody thinking that, well, this will absolve them of their sins, protect them from heresy, allow them entry into paradise, and it is all coming from a place of love. The reason I'm torturing you is because I just want the best for you, right?
So
and
first
it's
of all,
really
I'm not
coming
sure
from
that yours doesn't, right? Because yours stops with the notion of seeing them.
Yes.
And so so yours is not inconsistent with that either. Yours is just, in my opinion, less complete. Right?
Yeah, no, it is. No. But no, I wouldn't even say that it's more complete. I would argue that you're just tacking on things to the idea of agape that wasn't meant to be tacked on.
So what I'm trying to say is, what does it mean to really see someone? Even in your I'm trying to put it in your language, right? I would argue that merely feeling some bullshit feeling in your heart is not really seeing them. If you really saw that person as a person, you would invest in them, right?
But
even if that
investment
were just a smile, right? Without it leading to an action, it's not agape. Agape requires, otherwise it's not real. It's just some nonsense you're feeling and doesn't do anything, right? It won't have all the effects that agape has, because it didn't lead to anything. So if you have that feeling, if you have that perception of the other person as a person, right? What that means, and this is why I'm saying is, what that means is you see in them the potential for becoming more themselves. And that's where the Inquisition goes astray, is to presume that rather than you becoming the most yourself, you should become myself, right? That's where parenting goes astray. Is to say, instead of investing in my child, I mean, so many parents, like you and I have definitely experienced that, right? Is, well, I want to make you more like me, and that will be the development, rather than let me make you more like you, right? And I mean, actually, there's a great, one of the famous Gibran quotes in The Prophet, right? Where he says, speaking of children, you may seek to be like them, but seek not to make them like you. Right? And the notion there is that is the error of parenting, is in this agapic love, right? To what it means to really see them as a person is to see their personhood and the potential for them to become the most fully actualized version of themselves, and to help them on that path. Otherwise, you're not seeing them.
So do you understand? So we I started the summary off by defining the different kinds of love, right? Eros is the love of consumption, philia the love of cooperation, and I thought I defined agape as the unconditional love, such as the love that a child has for the parent. A parent has for the child, right? But in your understanding of agape, part of the definition then also is that love is directed towards some sort of character building exercise, or that the agape is just the sort of motivation for wanting someone to be their better self? What is agape then to you? I mean, another way of asking the question is, why do you need to even love somebody? Because you could have a teacher teaching you in a classroom, or a coach, at CrossFit or whatever, right? Wanting you to move further in your personhood, as you define the word, right? You don't need agape for any of that. You could hire a personal trainer, and they would get you to your goals without needing agape to be anywhere in the equation at all, right?
Good example. Yeah, good example. So I'll take that. If I hire a personal trainer, right, who does not have any kind of agapic feeling for me, right, then the transformation is a result of my loving myself. It is not, he is merely a tool. I'm using him erotically.
Why do you love yourself, though?
But
where did that come from?
That's what I'm saying, agapically, right? Is that I want myself to develop into my most sexual self.
So you are loving yourself? You are loving yourself agapically?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, yeah, I would absolutely say that.
Nowhere
but
in.
Let me finish the example here, right? However, it is also possible for a trainer or a CrossFit coach to have an agapic love for his students or his trainer, right? And that would provide extra impulse, extra motivation in the transformation, right? If he approaches his clients with an agapic love and invests deeply in them, right? That interaction would have a greater potential for transformation than if he just is sort of like there as a tool to be used, right? And or views his clients merely as sources of making money, right?
Yeah, but again, you don't need agape for that. If the trainer was saying, listen, I have to give constructive feedback, sometimes negative, to this client in order to make sure that they reach their full potential, because this is financially advantageous for me, I'll get a good reputation for being a good trainer. You don't need agape for that at all. You have no need for agape. Yeah,
and again, that's what I'm trying to say. There's you can do, and that's actually exactly my point. Actually, is I think that part of the challenge is that you can do the same behaviors out of philia, out of an exchange, out of eroticism, or you can do the same behaviors out of agape, but because the gestalt is different, the transformative potential is different. Like, if this trainer is purely financially motivated, he may give good advice. His information may be factual, right? His correction may be factual, but there's the transformation potential is lower because he's not putting agape into his investment is lower, and that's felt. Right? Whereas if he is agapically, and here's an interesting one, if he agapically loves his client, would he not say your form is wrong? Would he not say you're not pushing hard enough?
But he would say that if he was just a professional trainer who did a good job being a trainer, right?
He totally would.
You don't need agape for that at all.
I agree, but the
and I don't think you get much by adding agape to the equation. You just get a cold clinical. Or here, just to pretend you have a humanoid robot in 100 years. That's a personal trainer, right? Complete automaton, right? Gives excellent feedback every time you make a mistake. Does not give you any quarter whatsoever. You're saying that a human, equivalent personal trainer with agapic love would have significantly different outcomes.
110%. 110%. And I think that's our disagreement, or that's our when we talk about these humanoid robots, that's why we're uncomfortable. That's actually exactly why we're uncomfortable. It's not only about the information. Why do you need a personal trainer at all, actually? Why not look up online? Why do personal trainers have jobs at all today?
It's not because they're providing agape. I don't think that's the reason why. Right. I mean,
the good ones are. I disagree with that. The good ones are the coaches I've known, like especially.
Yeah, we were
my
tumbling
CrossFit
over the
coach. My CrossFit coach, 100% genuinely, because he feels that as his mission deeply, is to give that, and that's why he invests motivation and time
but is
and
that
energy.
Agape?
It's not just him.
Is that love? I mean, you're really stretching the definition here. Like a good motivational coach, you are putting agape there also. Like you're saying, that's really just agape.
A A good therapist, a good coach, a good the reason those have the
Okay, what
potential
about
for transformation
so
is because of
doctor?
agape.
A
Yes,
doctor, you would put in that
100%,
category as well.
100%. I mean, and yeah, I mean, I think that's the notion, right? Is that like otherwise you can do it mechanically or you can do it agapically, and though the transformational potential in those is different.
You're doing that thing again, which is annoying me, of course. But specifically, this whole conversation reminds me of the time that we talked about the whole, Buddha's explanation of enlightenment, right? That it was a immense transformative realignment of salience landscape, resulting in tremendous, almost metaphysical sort of experiences. And you turned that into, well, this is a great problem-solving exercise, right? And I got really hot and bothered. I'm like, no, it's more profound than that, right? And it seems like you're doing the same thing with agape, which is I'm saying that, no, this is a thing that turns a non-person to a person. And you're talking about it in the language of like, this would be great if we had, motivational coaches with agape, right? Or agape is really just about getting people to be their best selves. And it's not really anything more transformational than that, right?
Again, I think you're minimizing the degree to which I consider that profound. Moving someone in the direction of their deepest self, their most self is not a trivial thing at all. That is the greatest thing you can possibly do. So I think you're perceiving a triviality that I don't feel, in the sense that like, I don't think there's anything greater.
It may be profound. I mean, I'm not saying that it's trivial, but I'm saying that just the idea of agape, as I've understood it, is far more profound than that, right? To turn a non-person into a person, for a slave to think that he's more than that donkey on the field, right? And he's more than that.
Again with the
right?
anti-donkey.
No, it's a good. I don't know if maybe you can't see my perspective, because when I was thinking about this lecture, like all I could think about was all those child beggars that I saw in Pakistan growing up, right? Mm-hmm. And then I thought back to, well, Jesus lived in a time of like severe, like social stratification, where there were slaves and poor people. And again, I will put to you that the slaves and poor people that gravitated towards Jesus's message weren't doing it because Jesus was coming up with some character building, Tony Robbins like 10-step plan for a better you, right? It was much more profound an experience than that. Right? The beggar in the street wasn't saying, well, if I follow these teachings, I too will be rich and famous, or like, not be a beggar anymore. I'll be more myself as a result of these actions, right? I think it's more profound than that. It was coming in a society where there were humans on the earth, walking on the earth, that weren't thought of as actual humans. Like they were not even considered people. They were considered the same as cattle or whatever, right? Mm-hmm. Which is, by the way, slavery, in America was very much had the same sort of flavor as well, right? And they could have used agapic love there also. It would have completely neutralized the idea of slavery. Is like you can't think of these people as non-people. You have to think of them as humans, right? And that is a profound shift if it was something that occurred like 2,000 years ago. If Jesus comes and says, no, the solution to societal disorder is just to love each other unconditionally. You have to start there. And, what comes after that is, a question for, ethics and morality and philosophy and all that other stuff. But this is the substrate you need.
And I'm trying to tell you that, like, you are equating love with mere feeling. And I'm saying that real love requires action. If you, like, if somebody says, oh, Zane, I really love you. Like, somebody calls me from 10 years ago. I haven't talked to them in 10 years, right? And I'm like, well, where the fuck were you when I was going through a hard time? Like, what do you mean you love me? What does that even mean, right? It doesn't mean anything. It's merely a words in the mouth. It's not. If the feeling is in the heart, that is shown through that is one with the behaviors that come out of that, right? There's not a distinguishment between the feeling and the behavior, right? You can't, they're self-reinforcing in all the ways that we've discussed in this, right? And so that's what I'm trying to say is, what does it mean to love unconditionally? And because my definition is the unconditional love of agape is the willingness and the intention of investing in that other person's development. That is the behavior set that would inevitably is inextricably linked with this type of love. It's definitional, right? That's what I'm trying to say. It's not merely some feeling, right, that doesn't do anything. If the feeling were really there, you would do something, which Jesus did, and that's why it was such a powerful. Yeah, and so that's what I'm trying to say.
You would. No. But you would. But what you're saying, but what you're taking, so doing something could also just be not getting angry with them, showing them compassion, showing them kindness. These are actions, right? They're not just feelings, right? If someone cuts you off in traffic, for example, just as a common example, right? Someone cuts you off in traffic, you could think of that person as some non-person sitting in the car who almost like killed you or whatever. Or you could, extend a feeling of agape, like, okay, this person is a human. He's got a backstory,
absolutely.
Blah, 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 blah. I'm just going to forgive this person, this transgression, right? And that all comes from agape. And then you will never see that person again. You will never cross paths with that human again.
So the problem in your example is there's no room for communication to the person in the other car. Right?
Yeah, that's right.
Right. So let's take a different example, somebody who cuts you off in line.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Now, which one is truly more loving? I'm not saying it's not loving. It is an act of agapic love to say, hey, maybe that guy's got a rough deal, maybe he's having a rough day, maybe whatever, right? But to me, it would be more loving and something more like Jesus would do to take the guy aside and say, hey, man, like, you cut me off. What's going on? Right? That behavior is inappropriate and makes me concerned as to what's going on with you. It doesn't make the behavior appropriate. It's not okay, but the very non-okayness of the behavior has made me concerned for what's going on with you, right?
But
there
the problem
is
with
absolutely judgment in that, right? There is absolutely,
right.
But it is the judgment leads you to say, let me invest in this person. That's the sort of thing. That's why Jesus was such a profound figure, is he moved through the world that way. That's an insane way to move through the world. I mean, insanely admirable way to move through the world is if somebody cuts you off to respond with investment, right? Not merely like, oh, yeah, compassion, pity, okay, maybe he's having a tough time, cool, whatever. That's, okay, fine, it's something. It's some agape there, but not much. It's a thin soup.
Oh,
right?
I don't think so at all. I think that's actually pretty profound, actually.
I think that's a very thin soup compared to the notion of saying, hey, man, like, what's going on? Like, I noticed you cut me off, and I wonder what's going on with you. Like, that seems weird. That seems unusual. That seems like something that, you're better than. And that's personhood, is to have expectations of someone, is to you can't treat someone as a person if you don't expect anything of them. We don't expect things of children and dogs and donkeys, right? The lack of expectation is a denial of their personhood.
Wouldn't that make it conditional? Your love is conditional then?
No, I don't think so. That's my point. Is
what if they continue to fail to meet your expectations?
That's exactly right. That is love, is to maintain the expectation. To believe in them, to believe that they are capable, right? That's love. Otherwise, that's actually the opposite of love, is to dissolve the expectations. You can't really live up to it anyway. You're just a piece of shit.
No, you
can only achieve something if I beat you into it, right? Because you're a dog or you're a donkey.
And again,
or you're a child.
if agape is being defined as trying to affect outcomes in a certain moral direction, then your statement is correct, right? But if you stop the definition of agape as just the feeling of the love, and then what comes after is built on top of that, then
I'm trying to say you're not defining meaningfully what it is to see someone as a person. And I'm saying that to see them as a person is to hold expectations.
Sure. Let me
because
dive
all
into
the
that.
circumstances.
I'll dive into that, right? I mean, and again, I think I have already sort of like tried to conjure in your mind like what it is like to be, say, a slave.
You keep
in
going
Roman
back to the
times,
beggars
right?
and this and that. But my point is, like, even there is if the person attacks you with a knife, right? You're not like, oh, compassionately, like that's not even an agapic thing to do, and Jesus didn't, right? Like he did expect behaviors, he did rebuke people, he did say,
Yeah,
like,
but
this
again,
is
I mean,
right?
you could go into the Bible. I could even say, well, Jesus also said, turn the other cheek, right? I mean, you could like take out things from the Bible that support your point of view, and that would be we'd be here for 10 hours, right, talking about well what Jesus said to support our respective views, right? So he also preached nonviolence and turning the other cheek and all that other stuff. He also said,
Again, I don't think that he
an
preached
eye
on
for an
violence,
eye.
but that's a difference.
Yeah. So
Mm-hmm.
what does it mean?
Actually,
What does it mean?
Sorry, that goes back to a previous point, so it's worth making. The notion of not giving an eye for an eye, right, is exactly talking about the notion of what should justice look like, right? Is if you respond an eye for an eye, if you're responding from a vengeful place, that is not agapic, right? It's not saying that you should not invest in the other person to say, hey, like, you're not living up to your best potential, right? It's that when that person hurts you, if you respond merely by hurting them back, and that's justice, that's not agapic, right? Because it doesn't help that other person. Taking their eye out doesn't leave them with any development.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're sort of like making an interpretation. So here's the other issue with thinking of agape in the way that you're thinking about it, right? Is that you have to assume that the direction that you're trying to pull the person towards, agapically, is the right direction. Like, what if it's not, right? And so, you have to be clear about whether or not the moral codes you're trying to enforce, the characters you're trying to enforce agapically, are actually the right ones, right? I mean, they may not be. They may lead you to horrible places, right?
You've gone to a point of enforcement, and I'm trying to say, like, the notion is I have to, if I'm going to try and help you be the most authentic you can be, I have to ask questions.
Sure.
I have to find out what is the most authentic you can be. I have to understand you very, very deeply in order to but the notion there is I can invest in you universally and unconditionally. But that investment would take the form of listening, of investigating, trying to understand what direction you want to grow in or should grow in, and having debates with you. This conversation here, we're disagreeing. Why are you bothering to disagree with me? Why give a shit what I have to say?
My favorite thing to do is to
just purely selfish, right? But no, I think that notion of like, yeah, you don't disagree with people that you don't care about. Not at this level of depth. I don't. I just write them off. I'm like, whatever, right? I'm not Jesus in that regard. That's the amazing thing about Jesus, is he was able to form that and to invest deeply with a much wider set of his encounters.
Yeah, I think we're probably going to have more conversations offline as well about how we understand agape. Like you've taken a very what I would refer to as a jaundiced view, of what it means. I guess I'm triggered by the fact that my background was spirituality really was just in the Islamic world today, spirituality is just a set of rules. Follow this rule and that rule, then you are a good person and you're worthy, right? Mm-hmm. And when you say that agape is really about sort of trying to direct a person you love towards what is their best self, well, if I was receiving agapic love in Salafist Saudi Arabia or in the ISIS controlled territories, what I was being encouraged to turn into would be something that was just an anathema to my core being, right? But you could argue, well, no, this is all agape, it's all good, right? They have the best of intentions for you, right? And so the process can go haywire tremendously, right? If the character that's being trying to build up, as you say, agapically, is just some noxious toxic soup. And so if it can lead you in those directions, what's the profundity? How is this a profound idea at all, right? Because it gets hijacked by thinking that you have some sort of a monopoly on the truth of what it means to be good.
So I think that, yes, I think that the challenge that, and this is actually very similar in my mind from my perception of the argument we had about Buddhism that you cited before, right? Is my perception is you're looking for a final answer. That, oh, if I just have agape, then that's it, right? And I'm trying to say, no, agape doesn't get you out of the danger of self-delusion. The agape doesn't get you out of the need for all these other aspects. It is one more piece of the puzzle, right?
Yeah, no.
And so,
I totally agree with that.
And so, if you, yes, absolutely, many of the people who were encouraging you in those ways, not all of them, but maybe many of those people who were encouraging you into a more Salafi kind of thing were doing it agapically, right? But their self-delusion was getting in the way, not the agape. It wasn't a failure of agape, it was a failure of delusion, right? It was a failure of hey, let me, or freedom, right? The notion that, like, hey, let me, maybe it's okay to have a different view, and the notion of development is wider. I have a very narrow view of what development is, right? But from the knowledge that I have, I'm trying to give it to you with a pure heart. But that's not a failure of agape, that's a failure of knowledge. That's a failure of wisdom. The agape can be pure.
Yeah, but if if agape is just the engine that encourages us to want our fellow man to be better, right? Which is kind of like what you're saying, right? Is like
Kind of. Yeah.
the motivation, the thing that, I want, the reason I'm even arguing is because, I have agapic love for my fellow man and I want to see them be the best versions of themselves, right? I would argue if agape is reduced to that, it doesn't seem profound to me at all, right? It just sounds like this is what a good manager would do, right? This is what a good coach would do, a leader would do. And then you could throw in and say, no, there's love there. But that actually then smacks of bullshit to me. That's not love. If a coach is a good coach and great coach, yeah, maybe he has some affection for his, but is it agapic love, right? Is it the love of Jesus? I think that's a tremendous stretch, to say that that's where it comes from, right? You could have a culture where everyone understands that it's beneficial to encourage everyone to be their best selves. You don't need agape for any of that to work, right? Agape is not really necessary for that to be operant.
I disagree
right?
I disagree with that. I think that human beings would, without agapic love, trying to do that mechanically is so fatiguing that it would never happen.
I mean, you could argue that
notion of it, right?
You could argue that
imagine trying to raise a child that, like, I mean, that's why we admire motherhood so much, because it's fucking exhausting. Like, that level of investment and constant interaction and constant demand and constant, like, the constancy of it 24/7 out, 365. Like, where does that motivation come from? That's my point, is that's agape. The agape is the thing that makes that investment possible.
Sure, right? and that's very relatable for a mother to a child, right? But not from a doctor to a patient, right? Not from a coach to an athlete, all right? Not from a CrossFit, coach to, someone at the gym. You can't like extend it to all these other domains. You can't say, well, the mother's motivated by agape, and then bring that same energy to say, well, that's also what's happening when the coach is, training his athlete. It's the same energy.
But it's not always. My point is sometimes it is. It's not always. And in fact, I would say rarely. That's why I thought my CrossFit gym was very special, actually. Like, before it closed, because I think I got to know the owner, and truly, having known him, there was a significant degree of agape involved, right? Because he works his ass off 24/7, 365, because this mission is something that investing in his group, in his clients this way, is deeply meaningful to him, right? And went out of business in many ways, or this gym went out of business many ways because he prioritized investment during COVID because people didn't have money, right? And over the survival of his gym, he invested in the members, right? Like that's, I mean, literally put his money where his mouth was in many ways. And I'm glad he has another gym open in a different area and this and that. But like, no, man. I mean, again, not most gym owners don't. Most gym owners are not motivated agapically, right? But these people exist, right? And they create really special places when they do.
Yeah. So, our disagreement over here has been about how do you incorporate judgment, into an agapic stance to the world, right? And your solution is that judgment is basically integrated into agape. It's actually part of the process, right? And that's not how I understood it at all. And I'll also point out that this was the conflict that Saul had, right? And it makes sense, right? Is that how do you live your life agapically? I mean, the challenge that I had was, how do you day to day, as you am, I have to go and get some groceries today, right? And, I may encounter like somebody at the grocery store or, the checkout clerk or whatever, right? Is there opportunity for agape in all situations, right? Or is it just when I'm trying to direct another person, that is when agape actually comes into play. So if a person cuts me off, right, I have no connection to that person. I'm never going to see them again, right? I'm not going to have a chance to like run them off the road and then say, hey, I'm really concerned about you. Like, why did you cut me off? That's like the wrong thing to do, et cetera, right? Like trying to remediate.
Oh, wait,
agapically,
you don't
right?
do that?
Trying to remediate agapically is not available to me, in that circumstance. But can you bring that energy, could you just send out feelings of like, like the Buddhists do, like I wish you well and I wish you peace and happiness. And they do that, mostly for themselves also, not just necessarily for the person. But in your definition of agape, that experience is just not available to people whose character you cannot influence.
Yeah. So again, I think if you in your car example, right? I think the question of agape on some level is, how can I invest in this person's best interests, right? To the degree that my knowledge, my self-awareness, allows me to, right? And maybe the best thing you can do if you have no further contact is to not harbor ill will in your heart, right? Maybe that's the best you can do, right? But I mean, I don't really believe in hadith as a scripture, but I find them very moving sometimes. And one of the ones I've always been moved by is, the Muslims are required to give charity, the zakat, and the notion is sometimes even a smile can be charity, right? Mm-hmm. Is if you're that poor and you have nothing else to give, then just giving a smile to your wife in those dire straits is an act of charity, right? And that fulfills God's command in some sense. It's a matter of what you have to give and what investment you can make. And yeah, I do think that the notion of forgiving someone who's cut you off in traffic is just maybe the best you can do. But agape is in the real world, in daily interaction, in the grocery store, agape is available. But just not being a dick or like whatever, that's not the investment you could make. That's the challenge I find of the Christian view, and something, if you really wanted to follow Jesus's path, like, it's an imposition, the way a mother has an imposition from a child. It's really interacting with people and meeting people and saying, and face to face, and really engaging their full personhood. Right? It's not just seeing them, oh, there's a person, oh, there's a person, oh, there's a person. It's seeing, oh, hey, there's Bill, who I've never met before. What is he about? What's his eidos? That's his personhood. His eidos is his personhood. And so if I'm going to see that, you can't see that from a distance. You have to be in the muck, and that was the amazing thing about Jesus, is he wasn't sitting on a high hill in a castle somewhere making pronouncements. He was in the muck with everyone, right? And saying, hey, this is how you love. This is what love looks like. If you're not doing this, that's not agape. If you're not in there getting to really know the prostitutes and the beggars and the whatever, that's what agapic love looks like, right? That was the model he showed. Is everything else is a thin paste of like, oh yeah, nice to the beggar, like whatever. I'm not actively beating him, so I'm a great person, right? No. It's that beggar has an eidos. What is that? How can you shape that into? How can you be? Actually, Vervaeke said it. How can I make myself into an affordance for that person's transformation? And transformation into what? Into their greater self, right? Into their eidos, into a more complete eidos, right? And that's the notion: is are you really making yourself available for that person to become themselves?
Yeah, I still have difficulty with your interpretation, and part of it is I think what you're not appreciating is, I think for the vast majority of people, they neither have the emotional intelligence, the time, or the intellectual depth to be able to approach it with that level of sort of type 1 thinking, right? As like, oh, so-and-so has misbehaved, how can I interact with them in a way that maximizes their character, right? And this process is called agape, right? I mean, and I'm thinking about like, illiterate people, who've lived thousands of years ago.
Dude, we always run
They
into
have
this
no-
argument. And it does irritate me, so I can be irritated in return. Is when we are speaking and discussing and debating, I am giving you an articulated version of what I'm saying. It's not how it's felt. It's not how it's experienced in the moment. Those are harder to convey. It's experienced as a sense of just caring, right? Of being of and by caring I mean that at least in the moment their outcome matters to me, right? And so if I and so that comes out in 1,000 ways. Is how much attention do you give? Is it 100% of your attention? Now that's not agape in itself, giving 100% of your attention, but it is a necessary proof that you are interacting agapically. Like, if you are really interacting agapically, you are giving that attention, right? And so it's not, as we're talking about it, I'm articulating. And so it comes off as a very intellectual and very kind of like, delineated thing. But that's because we're talking. But the experience of agape that I have for you in this moment, right, is I care how well you do. I care how happy you are. I care how fulfilled you are, how much meaning you have in life. And I'm arguing with you out of the notion that I think this perception of agape will lead you astray. Now, I could be wrong, right? And that's for you to decide, and that's also agape. That's also the parent's love for the child, is to say, hey, at some point, they have to fly on their own and figure it out for themselves, right? Now, I'm not gonna hold back and not say that, hey, I think you're making a mistake here, right? But at some point, you have to say like, hey, I'm going to let you make that mistake.
Yeah.
Right.
So I think there's a bit of a misunderstanding in what you think my position is, right? So I sort of ended my summary by saying that Saul or Paul had this inner conflict about, well, how do you marry agapic love with judgment, right? And I think I ended my summary as well by sort of saying that, well, I don't think I put it in my summary, but I was thinking of when I was writing it, is that you know how we talked about, framing and reframing in meditation, right? So you break frame when you meditate, and then you reframe, concentrating in contemplation about your problem. And we sort of concluded in our own discussions is that as you break frame and then you try to reframe, there's a lot of wisdom that goes into the act of like, how do you properly reframe? And one of the things that occurred to me is that, yes, approach others with agapic love, but there is a world of wisdom involved in knowing how to make sure that that is not something that you let people exploit from you, right? So it's not. So I have a specific understanding of agape, which clearly is different from yours, and I don't think we're bridging that difference. But I think you're saying that, I believe that we should just, operationalize this, and it's all hunky dory. But I wasn't saying that at all. I'm saying, well, this is Jesus's explanation of agape. It's profound to me. I really am taken by the idea of taking non-persons to persons, and I can see how if there was more of this in the world would be a better place. But at the same time, I also recognize the pitfalls, right? Like, how do I know when to turn the other cheek and when to punch the guy in the face, right? Like, there's sometimes one is appropriate and the other is not appropriate, right? How do you make sure that you're not exploited by psychopaths who recognize that, you're doing this agape thing, let me go and try to extract as much as possible from you? So that is something that is not resolved in my mind. I don't know the answer to that, right?
And I guess what I'm saying is both of those actions could be agapic. Turning the other cheek or punching the other guy in the face, right? And the question that determines the difference, am I doing it for my sake or for yours? Right? And I think, so for instance, we talked about the drug addict, we talked about, there's so many other people where the most agapic thing you can do for them is to demonstrate what it looks like for someone to maintain their boundaries. Right? If someone has trouble with boundaries and is getting into trouble and is having a lot of problem because they don't maintain their boundaries with other people, and they're suffering because, well, I let this guy walk all over me, right? And she comes and she's a friend and she's like, I always let people walk over me and I'm suffering as a result. Well, I can advise her, hey, you need to keep your boundaries, you need to do this, you need to do that. If she tries to transgress my boundaries, right? Now, I could do that from a vengeance standpoint. How dare you? And right? Yeah. Or I can do it, let me show you what it looks like to enforce a boundary. You can't do this. That's not okay. And the reason I'm demonstrating is so that you get participatory knowing of what it is like for the other person to receive it and to be upset with you and for that to still be okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think the problem when you tack that conditionality to agape also, right, is that you are also then saying...
I'm not sure where you're coming up with the conditionality.
Well, so my definition of agape ends with just unconditional love. You're saying, no, what that actually means is that you have to, try to direct character and try to move people in certain directions.
Because what else does love mean? What is love?
Yeah, and so that's a very profound profound statement you made, right? Is that
but
love
I guess what I'm saying,
means...
I cannot conceive of actually loving someone and also not being deeply invested in their development.
No, but you can be
antithetical to me.
But you can be. But I'm saying that in the context of when we talk about agape, that's not part of the definition. I mean, it may lead there, and I would even argue that it leads there quite easily, right? And it naturally leads there. But to say that that's part of it, and that, without, having some enforcement of morality, enforcement of principles, and if you don't have that enforcement, then you don't have love at all. Like, in other words, a love doesn't come with some discipline, in other words, right? If there's no discipline there, then it's not love at all, right? And that's a peculiar definition of love, I suppose.
I disagree. I mean, I think that's where we're going. We've got this sort of this idea of love as this sort of thin pastiche of compassion and pity and
pity,
whatever, and it's some
kindness,
it's some feeling of bullshit that doesn't go anywhere. And I can't. That's not how parents love children, for sure. That's not how parents love children.
No,
ever.
but by cutting
right?
by cutting the definition off, like short of prescriptive actions, it doesn't mean that those prescriptive actions can't or shouldn't follow. I think what I'm pointing out to you is that if you are going to make the definition or make the sort of prescriptive corrective actions part of the definition, it can lead to some really crazy places, right? The Inquisition is all a story of agape.
And
in other
again,
words,
you,
right?
I've told you
The
before,
Nazi
that's not,
concentration death camps is all a story of agape. Right,
I think that's a little
you
bit
could
of a
you could
stretch, but
shoehorn
maybe.
anything. No, but if you connect morality to it, though, right? Morality can sometimes lead you to some really dark places, right? And then
Totally, and
the
that's what I'm
entire
trying to
thing
tell
doesn't
you.
look anything. But there's no love there at all. Like, how can you look at the
How do
Nazi
you know there's no
concentration
love
camps?
there?
Well, then
again,
it's
you
not
say
the
Nazi,
kind
well,
of love
okay,
I'm
you had
interested
a better
in.
you had a better example of Inquisition, right? Nazi concentration camps is hard to argue. I think Inquisition is a better example.
No. The Nazis thought that these Jews were non-humans. The only humans actually were the humans that lived in Germany, the Aryan race, and it was a work of love to purify the earth so that the non-Aryans did not live in it.
Yeah, but not love towards the Jews, right?
But they weren't humans. It didn't matter. They were just cattle. They were the donkeys, right? So that didn't matter at all. Right, but if there was agape, the way that I have understood it, right, then that error of judgment would not occur, right?
So then, why aren't you loving donkeys? Why aren't you having
because they're not
agape
humans?
towards donkeys?
Because they're not humans. Because Jesus
decide?
didn't tell me to love donkeys. He told me to love my fellow man.
Yeah, but how do you decide who is your fellow man?
Homo sapiens would be a good start. The same species as me would be a good start.
Why draw the line there?
Well, you got to draw the line somewhere. Now you're
no,
getting too absurd.
No, but there's a reason. I think there's a reason, right? The reason we draw that line at Homo sapiens is because we value the eidos of human beings, right? That's the notion, and that's like a donkey doesn't have the eidos of a human being. And so there's no I can't make that donkey more donkey. There's no investment. There's no way to do agapic love.
Yeah, I see your point. Yeah.
It's not that I'm choosing not to. It's that I can't.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, interesting to see that the entire conversation has been. I didn't think we would disagree here about the definition of agape.
Where did you think we would disagree?
Well, we haven't actually talked about this lecture in person. We were holding it off for the podcast, but you told me that you had related it to relationships, and I thought that would be where we would disagree because I didn't think, relationships as romantic relationships or relationships with our friends or parents. And that's not how I understood it at all. What was foundational to me is this idea of non-persons to persons, of you're not just a biological machine, an automaton, but there's more to you than that, right? And the only thing that distinguishes you from a biological system is the selfless act of love another biological system, like another human, gives to you, imparts to you. And that act is what makes a human and not just a biological machine. And I thought that was a very profound statement. And again, I recalled to mind the milieu in which this ideology was first promoted. Right, we're all used to a world in the West without slavery and with minimal sort of social stratification. These are all, by the way, beneficiary. The inheritance of Christianity. Totally. By the way, right? That's why we think this way. Right, it all came from that agapic sort of everybody is deserving of love, right?
Sure.
And we've taken it for granted. And you've taken the thing that we take for granted and you've taken it another degree further, which I think is, by the way, is the correct degree. I agree with you that we should act this way, but I'm just saying that that's not, Jesus wasn't extending it in that direction, right? That is once that's baked into the cake, then you can build on top of that, right? Okay, then once we have the agapic love, where do we take it, right? But I think, he was just speaking to a world where that didn't even exist at all, right? They were actual humans living on Earth that did not feel like they were treated as humans. They weren't regarded by society as humans, as real people, right?
And again, I come back to to me, the profound insight there, and we can move into relationships because that might actually help us come back to this and flesh it out a little bit. But I do think that the profound insight there is that slave has an eidos. Right, that slave has potential, directionality, is a part of the open future of the Israeli God, right? And that notion of and so if he has an eidos, then shaping that, then contributing to that is that to me is agape, right? And so if we transition into where we thought we would disagree, which is relationships, I have felt like, in most of my relationships, the basis, the initial interaction has to be agape, right? And then what you hope for is an agapic love in return. And where I am interested and kind of curious is if I'm loving you agapically and you're loving me agapically, right? Is there philia that comes out of that? And then each of us is also loving each other erotically in some sense, because I'm loving you agapically, and in that moment you're having an erotic love, right? And vice versa, right? And so if two people love each other agapically, I think you end up with all the other things on top of it, because it's both cooperative and each person is experiencing eros as well, right? And not that there aren't separate things to do there in addition, right? So I think if you both are loving each other erotically at the same moment, that's a particular experience. If you're cooperating together, that's a different experience. But there also is this interchange of agape, and I think that's, again, I think that notion of really investing in the other person's eidos. And you have to understand it first. I think that's something where a lot of relationships go astray, is you can't really agapically love someone if you're not trying to understand them, right? Because you have to figure out what that eidos is before you can invest in it meaningfully.
And I think we disagree here is that I don't think that that's necessary, right? That's not what Jesus was talking about. But again, we could argue about this.
Wait,
I wasn't few weeks in person as well.
I'm not sure where you got to Jesus from this. I was talking about relationships.
Yeah, no. Again, I mean, the conversation then, just comes back down to what actually is agape, right? And, again, part of your definition is no, there has to be some sort of a constructive action that is born out of love, right? And without the constructive action, it's not agape at all, right? And but yeah, I can see how
I'll refer you to Vervaeke. This is a direct quote that I wrote down: is making oneself into an affordance for another's transformation, right? And so
but the way I understood that was the pure unconditional love that then allowed the other person to transform themselves from a non-person into a person. That's how I understood that statement.
But
because there's context all around there.
I think because you're refusing to define love, you're refusing to define personhood, you're refusing to define any of these terms, then you're leaving it vague, and it ends up as some soup of emotion that doesn't. And that's where we're disagreeing. Is I'm saying that it is inherent to actually loving someone to be invested in their development. Those things are not separable. And you're trying to say, oh, there's the emotion on one side, and then there's the investment separately. And I'm saying those two things can't.
Yeah,
they are.
I mean, that
part of the same definition.
That kind of love is not just an emotion necessarily, right? Because you have to conjure it up, right? And it's not obvious that you can just conjure up emotions. I can't just decide that I'm going to conjure up happiness or sadness or envy, and presto chango. The emotions are in my heart and my head. I mean, that kind of love is almost it's an act, right? Is that, okay, you have slighted me in some way, or you are terrible to me in some way, and I'm going to, forgive. I'm going to just give you, or, treat you lovingly.
I think he says that is a trivialization of what's being said here. It's not just about forgiving in the modern sense. It is forgiving. It is giving to someone
before they deserve it.
Without, not in a response to, not as a response, but just giving, right? But giving what? What does it mean to give to another person? What are you giving, if not investment in their eidos? That's my point, is that there is only one thing that can be meaningfully given.
Well, so hopefully we're just going in circles, so let's just call it at this point. I got to take off anyway, but I do hope that we have people that see this lecture in the weeks and years to come and
realize how wrong you are. That's yes. I
And
hope that as
comment
well.
down below.
That's,
No, and comment down below, because it's
yeah.
this is an interesting point of disagreement, right? And I think there's more profound things to be said about why we just personally have so completely different interpretations of what it means to love another person. I think that's like a thing me and you
Yes.
should talk
That's
about offline at some point.
yeah, no, I think that is the essence of where we disagree. Actually, I think
Yeah, yeah.
that's a good framing of and yeah, as always, man. I mean, I think useful to see counterpoints and flesh out different views and kind of say, okay, two people can view the notion of love very differently, and where does that lead us in different ways?
Yeah, definitely interesting. Definitely interesting. All right, my friend. Until the next
All right,
one,
man.
the next brilliant
Absolutely.
lecture, where we will hopefully disagree a little
Disagree
bit
more.
less.
Less. Why less?
Well, it seems like we've sort of like just belabored like one point for like I don't even know how long we've been talking now, like 2 hours almost.
An
or-
hour and 45. Yeah, almost 2
yeah.
hours.
So
Which
belabored
I
it
think
on
that's
just
great.
one point of definition. So I feel a little bit frustrated in that it seems like we
I think
just
I
talking
perceive your first.
past each other.
Well, I think we disagree. I think and sometimes, and I think it's hard too. I think the reality is in these kinds of disagreements, there has to be kind of like, okay, pause conversation, come back to it. Like things have to sink in, right? I mean, we're just coming at it from such different points of view, and so
Interestingly, like we have deliberately avoided talking about this in our personal chats. And I've been wanting to talk about this lecture for like 2 months now. It's just been so busy at work.
Well,
and
I've
you've been
fixed
busy
that
as
at
well.
least.
Yeah.
At least I've fixed that.
and
You
so
can now relax and be like, I don't want to
I-
talk about that at all.
No. Now I'm like, we need to
No, I'm
argue
just
about this more. But I think
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
one
yeah.
of those things where whatever you said, I need to digest. I don't think you're going to even regard what I've said, but I need to digest what you
No,
have
I
to
wouldn't.
say.
Why would I pollute my brain with inferior ideas? That would be absurd.
And then reapproach this. No, because this is a really fascinating
Yeah,
divergence of opinion, right? Not just like about this lecture, is about like just why you personally have this perspective of what love is, and why I have it totally different. And what it says about our mutual personalities is that you went in that direction right away, and I went in a totally different direction.
A few weeks later, we decided we had to come back for part 2 here. I think after our last discussion, where there was some frustration and definitely some disagreement, seeing things differently. And in other discussions, we kind of decided it was worth really revisiting the topic rather than just sort of like leaving it at that point and maybe adding some additional thoughts. So here we are back again, part 2 of number 16. Kind of dive right into maybe like some of the additional thoughts you've had on the topic.
Yeah, I did. Your positions on what love is, what agape is, had me thinking a little bit, and I kind of have, a few, sort of comeback thoughts after now that we've had, maybe a few weeks to digest that conversation, right? And one of the thoughts I had, your basic position was, correct me if I'm wrong, but the main thesis was that unconditional love, what it means to love really is that you would want to make the other person better. And what it really means, to love a person is to wish well for them. And what that kind of wishing well is perhaps a remediative or corrective kind of posture when you see the other person doing something that is, not consonant with, quote unquote, the good, right? Or they're not being their best selves, or they're not following the right course of action. And your definition of love was that was an inherent part of what it meant to love somebody. That that was the essence of compassion almost, is that you care enough to have, say, a difficult conversation with a person to sort of remediate them, right? Whereas my position was that, it's actually just the core sentiment of compassion and recognizing the other as being worthy of, just being alive, worthy of respect, worthy of dignity, that those things were really what Jesus was talking about, right? And I had, then it occurred to me that in our disagreement, you were like Paul in the biblical story, right? And this should help, elevate your ego a little bit. So you're probably happy to hear that I'm comparing you to a major biblical figure here. But, Paul had the same tension, right? So in the lecture, Vervaeke's lecture, Paul, actually came from sort of, he was, I don't know if he was an official in Rome, right? But he was very much concerned with law and justice and, following, Roman laws, even though he was a Jew at the same time. And the tension that he had, if you were to characterize this, is that, well, how can you, unconditionally love somebody if you have to conditionally judge them also at the same time, sometimes, right? So if you murder somebody, right, now, what does it mean in that towards that murder? What does love look like in that situation, right? And if you were to take the pure Jesus view of like, well, this unconditional love, as it's understood, I suppose, then it becomes very difficult to think about, well, what do I do now with this murderer? Like, how do I love them, right? Do I execute them, right? Because that's, that law of the land, right? Or should I just forgive them, right? And that was a tension. And perhaps Paul resolved that tension, mythologically by saying, well, that's what Jesus' crucifixion was all about, right? That, the balance, the need for justice was restored when God sacrificed his own son, right? Because somebody had to pay, right? And so it was Jesus who paid, and that's how Jesus died for our sins, right? And that's sort of the main tension. And one of the ways I thought about reconciling that was that Jesus, well, first of all, that moralizing hierarchical values, right, have always been with us, right? So I guess the tension is this. The tension is between agape and a hierarchy of values external to agape. Once you say you have agape, that's fine, right? But then, is stealing wrong, right? Is adultery wrong? Are these, 10,000 other things right or wrong? You're still trying to aim society to a certain moral direction, right? And you can't do that just with agape alone. You need some kind of judgment there.
Well, again, the tension I think between us on some level is how much of that, what exactly is included in agape. So I agreed and disagreed with your summary of my position. I agreed with the second half of it, but the first half, the idea that that agape was about making someone a better person, I don't necessarily know that I would agree with that characterization. I think the central issue, and likewise, just after our discussion, I've had a lot of time to reflect on your points as well. And to me, it came down to the notion of what exactly is it to see someone as a person, right? And I think that, like, typically the common perception of Jesus on some level, which is a bit sort of whitewashed in some sense, in multiple ways, it like views it as only half of what I would consider to be seeing someone as a person, right? Which is in some ways the rights of that person, the right to sort of have you understand their context. Why did they steal that loaf of bread? What's going on there, right? Some compassion for the notion that, like, a rigorous why did they kill that person? Like, what was there, was this their rapist? Was this, like, what happened there? Right? Some compassion for the context of the person. That's half of it. But the other half of seeing someone as a person is the expectation of moral action, right? There is a set of responsibilities that is implied as well. And we see that often in people that we don't really count as people, right? So we don't really count children as full people. We view them as on their way to becoming people, but they're not full people. Somebody that has very limited IQ, right? Someone who's very intellectually limited to the point that they're barely functioning, right? We don't treat them with the same moral expectations because on some level, and that was very important in, for instance, the slave trade, right? Is to say these aren't really full humans. We're doing them a favor, actually, by putting them to good work that they would not sort of come up with on their own. There is a denial of their capacity to self-direct, right? And by imposing our religion, we're helping them out by giving them a moral compass they would not otherwise have. And you see that even in like the notion of like punishment, right? If you're talking about a dog, you train a dog by operant conditioning, right? You give positive and negative stimuli to get the outcomes that you want. You don't reason with the dog, right? It's not a person. There's not a person there to reason with. Whereas when you see someone as a person, you engage, you engage them with reason because you expect them to function as a rational moral agent on some level, right? And so that communication, that dialogue, and by the way, I should say this too, just up front, I realized in retrospect, just for also the people listening, how much of my view of this was influenced by the book Speaker for the Dead. I really think it's a phenomenal book, and I didn't even realize until very, the end of the conversation or just after, how much of what I was saying was influenced by the power of that book and the way it switched my own thinking on what agapic love is on some level, even before I knew the term. He paints a phenomenal picture that is very counter to the standards. And he's Mormon, right? The author, which is interesting.
Yeah, I forget his name. I can't believe I forgot
Orson
his name.
Scott Card.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's very Christian-centric, of course,
yeah. Yeah, and even if you'll forgive me a bit of a long a quote, I'll try and paraphrase a little bit. In one of the beginnings of the chapters, he has someone telling a story about different worlds, right? And he said, there was one world on which, a woman was accused of adultery in the town square, and all the townspeople had gathered together to stone her to death. And a rabbi walked in and said, who of you has not desired another man's wife or another woman's husband? And they replied, yes, Rabbi, but we haven't acted on the desire. Then he said, well, you should kneel and give thanks that God has made you strong, right? And they were abashed, and they knelt, and he led the woman out of the marketplace, and he whispered in her ear, tell the magistrate who saved his mistress, and he'll know that I'm his friend, right? And thus the society was destroyed because it was too corrupt to enforce the law. On another world, similar marketplace, similar woman, a rabbi came in and said, let he who is without sin cast the first stone. And the people were abashed and dropped their stones. And he picked up a stone and dashed the woman's brains in and killed her. And he said, well, if we waited only for the sinless to enforce the law, it would never be enforced, right? And thus the society was destroyed because it was too rigid to enforce the deviation. Only one man has insisted that we be rigid enough to enforce the law and also able to forgive the deviation. And so naturally, we killed him. And so that was it's an interesting notion, this tension, right? Is that Jesus did ask us to uphold the law, but also to forgive the deviation. And therein, that tension is not agape versus something else, is my contention. That is agape. That tension, agape contains that tension, because when you see another human and you interact with them as a person, you reason with them, you talk with them, but you also expect them to uphold moral standards. You also expect them not to be a sociopath.
Yeah, no, I understand. That's a good rehashing of your position. I think there's a more meta, a statement to be made about this position of yours, right? Which you don't really get to, which is that you are implying that it is understood what the correct, sort of moral direction is, right? That there's an agreement there amongst, the people who are engaging with each other about what direction is it that we want to go towards, right?
So no, not necessarily, though. Well, okay, half and half. That's half true, I would say. I do think that most religions are in some way implying what in philosophy is called a moral realist stance, right? Meaning that the right thing to do exists. It's not relativist. It's not culture.
it's not purely a matter of culture. That cultures can be wrong in their perception of morality, right? And so, yes, I think the implication is that there is a moral truth there to get at. Not necessarily that it's known to either party, right? Both, and that's the need for dialogue, right? Is that we're both we're going to wrestle together verbally rather than with violence.
Yeah, so the problem occurs when these these kind of moralizing structures, the hierarchy of values, right? They become structural after a while, right? They become almost like ideologies, or they attain their own sort of superstructure, that you have to sort of then conform to. The problem becomes when people start worshiping the structure and not the spirit in which the structure should be enforced. Right, and so I
That's
actually
really well
understand.
Said. That's actually really well said.
Yeah,
go ahead, but that's yeah.
So I understand why you are hesitant to sort of like separate the hierarchy of values that must be sort of agapically pursued with just raw unconditional love and acceptance and dignity and all of those things, right? I understand.
Or just to clarify, and I know you know that, but just to clarify. That there is a hierarchy of values. Maybe not that I know what it is or you know what it is. But yeah,
that there
is a exactly.
Correct. Yeah.
Just clear. Yeah.
But the problem is that I understand your reason for wanting to fuse them together, right? Because compassion can also go awry in many ways, right? So, like, you could argue that, communism, right, was founded, right, because Karl Marx was just compassionately obsessed with the plight of the working man and wealth disparity, and he had as much concern about poor people as Jesus did, right? And he just, came up with a very complex philosophy to try to fix the problem. And then, born out of compassion, millions of people died in all of the different applications of communism, right? So it is very correct to argue that entire idea started from a place of love and compassion that Jesus would have looked at, right? And I mean, there's a lot of commonalities between some of the stuff Jesus says about charity and like giving to the poor and wealth and communism, right? There's a lot of shared DNA in those ideas, right? In the idea that there's something inherently evil about being rich, right? Or
and the difference between them is important, though, right? Like, because the big difference between them is whether that is a set of individual choices made by individual moral agents, or is that enforced by the state, right? And there's a great quote by Milton Friedman. He's talking to a college student, right? And he said that, look, the issue is that if morality is enforced, it's actually not morally applaudable. If you see somebody drowning, right, we would hope that you would maybe go to help, right, and maybe even risk your own life to help. But if that is merely because the state will kill you if you don't, it loses all of its moral value, right? And so that is the huge difference between Marx and Jesus in a lot of ways, is where is the center of
I don't think whether the state is operational or enforcing is really the heart of the matter. I mean, I can come up with a different example. The Spanish Inquisition, right, was born out of also this similar concern for compassion, and we are just concerned about your souls, and your soul is what's most important. So let's torture you a little bit to cleanse your soul, have you recant your heretical statements, so that you can eventually, when you do die, go to heaven. Right, and that is all born out of compassion.
So your disagreement with me on agape, you're saying that I should engage in is that where is that was that my mistake?
I'm pointing out to you how when the hierarchy of values is fused with agape as like this is part and parcel of it, right? Then you can lose your way quite easily and commit atrocities in the name of love, and then lose sight of the underlying a spirit in which this was meant to be enforced to begin with, right? And I have another maybe a somewhat original take on the whole Jesus and agape, is that these hierarchy of values have always existed. They existed before Jesus. They they existed after. It's not like Jesus came and invented like, hey, hierarchy of values, and what it means to love is to enforce the hierarchy of values, right? That he didn't innovate a hierarchy of values at all. What he innovated was that we should try our best to enforce our hierarchy of values with this agapic love, where we err for compassion, and we err on the side of forgiveness, and we err on the side of love and kindness. Which is not to say that that's a just black and white, that you just treat that with everything, and perhaps what Jesus was saying is that whatever hierarchy of values you end up coming up with, right, this should be the underlying spirit in which it's enforced, right? And I think it would be correct to say that perhaps Jesus was meaning to inspire the flavor of the hierarchy of values that we settled on in the generations to come. His teachings weren't meant to be prescriptive, but meant to be inspiring of whatever prescriptions we came up with. Right? Is that different societies will have different hierarchy of values. They shift slightly from time to time, but if the core engine of it is like, what, all humans are worthy just because they're human. All human are worthy of dignity and kindness and compassion. Now, of course, if you go rape and murder, then we're going to have to figure out how to reconcile and everything. Then if we kill you even because you've raped and pillaged and murdered, while we are shooting you or burning you at the stake or whatever, however it is we're killing you, we're not going to be calling you names. We're going to hope that your family is fine, whatever it is. I mean, there's ways to do that where you can even commit atrocities, or you can kill a person and say and apologize for it, right? Even a good it occurred to me when I was thinking about that this morning is, if you were to imagine a society, like highly evolved society with complex hierarchy of values, that had within those complex hierarchy of values imbued within it agapic love. I was trying to think about what even mythological structure or, from story could I come up with that would encapsulate a society built around agapic love, where all sentient beings were, or intelligent, conscious sentient beings were, viewed with agapic love. And the first society that sprung to mind was the Star Trek, pantheon, right? Because they very much the first directive was very much like I mean, the first directive perhaps not, but they considered all life to be sacred, right? And they were moved with a concern to make sure they protected life and respected life and all of that other stuff.
What's really interesting is that Orson Scott Card's book Speaker for the Dead, in large part, is a brutal refutation of the Prime Directive.
Yeah, we actually in private had a conversation about the first directive, so that was probably the wrong directive. Well,
no, but I mean, I get what you're saying though in terms of the spirit of the story, and I would still say, oddly enough, to your point, that the Prime Directive clashes with Star Trek's ethos in a really weird way. Like, it's one of those weird things that, you can't make many episodes about the Prime Directive because it really doesn't fit. Yeah, right.
We are getting off tangent here because I should have mentioned the Prime Directive, because that's not. It probably, I agree with you. It's the Prime Directive is probably not a good directive, to not interfere with civilizations until they themselves have reached spacefaring technology, as I think that what the Prime Directive is. Again, we can talk about that for 2 hours. But again, my general point was that, the Star Trek, society, right? I'm talking about TNG and the original Star Trek, was probably infused very much with these agapic principles, right? And they had very much, very complex sort of ethics on how do we do whatever, and none of that came from Jesus, right? But the underlying spirit in which it was, approached, everything, the base layer for all axioms, right, was that everyone
and many people have
dignity.
said that Western civilization, in so many ways, is infused with, exactly right, right.
And in fact, this is actually why.
It.
This is why I think, you sort of operationalized how do you do agape. right? Like you should do it, with the view of corrective action and all of this other stuff. And I
As a
think,
part of
that
it.
view,
And
but that's a part that I didn't really agree with, right? Which is that I don't think that's part of the thing. But I understand why
yes.
you did it, right? Because you have taken just like, hey, all human beings deserve dignity and compassion as such an axiomatic truth that you couldn't but help expand on the idea of agape. Is like, well, surely there's more to it than just like love. Everyone is deserving of dignity and love and respect. Surely there must be some more to be said about the subject. Whereas I think one of the points I was trying to make to you is that in Jesus' time, this was like a radical idea. The idea that if you were a slave or a poor person or like, some ethnicity that was conquered by, the Romans, that you were just at this point a non-person. Like you were just
So
an other.
so actually, okay, I'm literally quoting Speaker for the Dead now repeatedly, but our prime directive thing was actually pretty on point, right?
Okay.
Because the whole notion of seeing a Roman slave as not a person is very much the prime directive, right? Is that's not a person, we don't treat them with the same rules, right? So so the quote from Speaker for the Dead, he again, it's a sci-fi book, right? So we talk about other worlds and so on and so forth, but he defines orders of foreignness, right? So there's first the Utlaning, which is the person we recognize as human but of another country on our world. Then there's the Fromling, the person we recognize as human but of another world. There's the Ramen, which is the person we recognize as human but of a different species. And then there is the Verels, which is that which we cannot recognize as human, right? And the claim is that when we recognize, and the book is about finding another species and recognizing it as sentient and so on and so forth, but the claim is that when we recognize another species as Ramen and not Verels, it doesn't mean that they have passed a threshold of moral maturity. It means we have. And the same could be said for the notion of seeing a slave as a person, right? So part of the claim of Jesus is not just the notion of agape, but how broadly is it implied, right? If you are a slave in a Roman view on some level, it's not that I'm not acting agapically. That's not a person. I'm being agapic with all the actual people, right? Jesus' claim is that there's a moral threshold to achieve, to cross, when you are able to recognize the humanity broader and treat them as people and apply all the same logic and attitudes and behaviors that you bring to bear for people. Now that doesn't, and that's about how do you treat people. Like it doesn't mean that you let, compassion only run amok, right? But it's all of it, right? And I would say that if you're in a society, maybe Roman society in that regard, that is very legalistic, right? And very focused on the law, then adding agape is an addition of compassion. By contrast, in our modern society, in a lot of ways, we've taken, or a communist society or something like, we've taken compassion too far. And so the agapic thing is to add judgment, right? To add responsibility and to say, no. Being a person means I get to expect certain things of you, right? And so it's the agape, to me, at least, agape includes both. And what we see at different times in different places is whichever way the society has sort of leaned over, the agapic thing that starts to be highlighted is the missing piece.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. Yeah, I mean, again, like there's a fusion in your mind, right? That is the word corrective action, imprecise, do you think?
It
corrective
is.
moral, what is a better label for what it is that you're getting at?
Actually, expectation is probably the closest.
Okay, right. Okay, so, imbued in that, of course, is the idea, again, maybe we're just repeating ourselves.
But we're wrestling with an idea, so.
Where imbued in the expectation is that there's a certain hierarchy of values that you must adhere to, right? And I think again, my understanding of agape is that is then separate from the core value that Jesus taught us. He's like the most important. Paul said this. If I have not, if I have, he was in the Vervaeke speech as well. He was talking about like I may have accomplished all this other stuff, but if I haven't loved, then I am nothing. Like I've done nothing. Right? It's like I've accomplished nothing at all. Right? So. Like in my mind, like the engine is the only value Jesus has given us is like you just have to approach it with agape, and the rest you have to figure out as society evolves and needs change. How much should we pay in taxes, right? That's like a kind of a moral decision as well on some level. But you can't prescribe that in the Bible, right? You gotta feel your way through a moral decision like that, right? And again, with all of these sort of moral values and hierarchies that we adopt, if we're doing it with an agapic energy, the hierarchy of values would be better structured then.
And
right?
and
I'm giving you one value.
Going back to your Spanish Inquisition example, I think a great example is also making sure you're not bullshitting yourself about what your real motivation is, right? You may claim, oh, this is being done out of compassion and this and that, but you can be bullshitting yourself about what the motivation is there, and it could actually be a very same with communism on some level,
but I
right?
would point out to you that if you truly had
implementation
internalized
of communism.
I would point out to you, though, if you had truly internalized agape, right, and said, listen, everything flows from that, right? Then the minute, you're there in the Spanish Inquisition, and the minute you're like, shoving some hot iron rod up someone's butt, right, because you just want to wash them of their sins, that is so disconsonant with agapic love that you can't but realize that you're in the wrong place. You have your hierarchy of values have led you to a dark conclusion, and it would only be with this agapic undertone that you would recognize that. Right, because you are still operating perfectly correctly within your hierarchy of values. If you're torturing someone during the Spanish Inquisition, you're not doing anything wrong, right? You are in the moral clear, right? But if you really had the agapic love, right? If you really
but
viewed
the
it from
evolution, I would say, of even Western civilization in some sense toward its more modern implementation, right, is, I think, I would argue, or at least I'm arguing right now, pops into my head as we're having this conversation, that's an evolution of where these ideas go, right? Which is that if I see you as a moral agent, what is the limit of what I can expect from you, right? Meaning, I have to be able to expect that we agree on certain things, like not murdering, not wantonly murdering, right? Or wantonly raping people or whatever, right? But through the excesses of something like the Spanish Inquisition, I think we realize that actually you, as a moral agent, you get to choose some significant parts of your hierarchy of values. Maybe not everything, right? But it is not agapic to impose my hierarchy of values. That was something that's realized in some way through error in these different ways. But again, lurching from one side to the other, being too rigid, right? And then being too permissive on the other end. And I think a lot of what we struggle with, you and I, in the modern society is we feel, rightly or wrongly, that it's gotten a bit too permissive. We've lost a hierarchy of values at all. We can't find our way, right?
Right.
And so it's this balance that I think is agapic, and I think you can see that even in our previous examples of child rearing. So like if you're brought up in a very authoritarian way, right, then your view of agape is the compassion portion because that's what you're missing. Now, modern children, who are brought up with complete compassion, you want to do whatever you want, like whatever, no rules, no hierarchy of value. Well, many of them grow up and say, I've known several, young people that are really hurt by the notion that their parents did not make them into people. Their parents left them with work that they have to do as adults because they did not create a hierarchy of values. They did not enforce they did not expect anything of them. They were permitted to do everything, right? So that balance between the compassionate, what we might term the compassionate side, and what we might term the expectation side, the combination, my contention is, it's the combination that allows a child to become a person, because that's what it is to see a person, is to both understand their story compassionately and also still have expectations that, okay, hey, I understand you're having a rough day. That doesn't mean you just get to come, beat your wife. Like, that's not, like, I understand and I'm compassionate to the fact that you're stressful, but I expect you to still adhere to certain, and it's both that makes me see you as a person.
I think, these sort of expectations are super important, right? So when I say that I don't think that's actually part of the core agapic message, I don't mean to imply that the hierarchy of values are not important at all. And one of the thoughts I also had is, I think your predilection to, drag in a hierarchy of values and staple that to the definition of agape probably comes from what you just described, this culture where it seems like we've become a bit too permissive, right? And your bias is to make sure that, whatever, definition of agape should incorporate hierarchy of values, because it seems like we've lost that in modern society. So I would
I don't think that's true. I
that
think that's
you
an unfair
maybe
characterization. I actually think I would take exception to that, because, again, my example is the notion of child rearing, right? Is that because that's what agape, I mean, that's how Vervaeke kind of even defines agape, right? Is the love that makes non-persons into persons, right? And the parent-child metaphor is a very strong one in that frame, right? So I'm leaning on that specifically, not out of, I would argue, I hope, there's no way to know what's out of bias, right? But my contention is that that's not a bias, that's actually what we see in front of us, is that excessively authoritative parenting is missing some of the agapic point, excessively permissive parenting is missing some of the agapic point, and part of the reason I'm insisting on fusing them is in response to Paul, is I think he is seeing a false dichotomy that creates a tension where one does not exist. It's both. And both are necessary, and it's, again, an optimal grip issue, right? Is agape requires an optimal grip on the balance between permissivity and expectation.
Yeah. It reminds me of another word that's come up in these conversations about Vervaeke's lectures, which is discernment, right? The core of wisdom is discernment, right? And so recognizing the balance between, enforcing expectations and, boundless compassion, perhaps there's discernment to be had there, right? Another thing that occurred to me as well is that, agapic love in per your definition can look very different when it's viewed through a lens of, friend-friend relationship, a parent-son relationship, sibling to sibling, employee to employer. All of those have different sort of like dynamics to them, right? And agapic love would look quite different, right? And that sort of reinforces the idea that, if your core engine, is to just sort of run on, compassion and, wanting good for the other, then it is, a wise person would be a person that learns how to utilize that agapic love appropriately in the most number of settings, how to have the optimal grip in the most number of settings. So they would behave agapically towards, an errant son, that was misbehaving, and they would also, behave agapically towards a good employee, who's doing a great job, right? And in both cases, try to figure out how to, not give too much, in terms of the compassion, or not show it, because that could also be perceived. For example, if you're dealing with a psychopath, right? Perhaps you could approach them agapically, but perhaps not be so effusive in your willingness to compromise, in your willingness to, accommodate them, right? Because you feel that that's not going to help anybody if you do that, right? And that's where sort of discernment comes in.
It's an interesting notion, even the notion of a psychopath, right? Rather than a murderer, right? The reason we kind of carve those out is because, to some degree, we're claiming that the psychopath is not as much of a person. There's an inherency, not a set of choices, right? There's an inherent empathetic deficiency that we're saying, hey, we can't really treat this, even though it has a human form, we can't treat this with the rules that we treat humans, right? Whereas a murderer, part of what we're saying is, hey, like, you've made some choices here, right? You're a person, and we expect you to do better, right? And so, yeah, I think those categories highlight part of what we're trying to carve out when we interact with people. It's rare now in Western civilization to see human-shaped animals and not assign them personhood. That's why I have to find examples like low IQ or children or psychopaths, or there's maybe a few where we kind of are still fudging the edges here, right? But to a large degree, as a result of Christianity, our society has insisted that if it's a human-shaped animal, you have to treat it as human. You have to see it as a person, right? And that's very much the agapic kind of impulse there. A profound impact, because, that's not how we saw slaves, like even in this country, right? It's not people, right? And thus you can't expect much from them. They're all the rhetoric around, well, the slave mind can't understand this or that, right? And thus there's a condescension in not having expectations that denies the personhood of that's keeping them enslaved in some sense, in your mind.
Yeah, I wonder if there's a way to sort of bridge our differences with some kind of a prescriptive.
There is. I mean,
posture
you can
of
just
how
realize that you're wrong, and then
because
that'll immediately
we did
bridge the difference.
we did that, I think, with the lecture on meditation, right, where you had some very I think good counter arguments, and then you made me change my view on what meditation can do, because we could rehash that very quickly, right? Where I've been a meditator for a long time, and I've had a lot of value from it. And one of the struggles I always had is like, yes, I can see the contents of my mind a lot more clearly. I can see the ways in which my mind sort of just traps me into these circles of angst. And then you pointed out, well, maybe sometimes when it traps you, you should be listening to what it's saying, right? And you should not be so quick to just try to neutralize it. Perhaps it's giving you a signal, and perhaps you should welcome that angst because it's a signal that something needs to change, right? And and that's not always the case, right? Sometimes you're just yelling at somebody who cut you off in traffic, right? Yeah,
sure.
Exactly. It comes down to discernment, right? Which is that choose what it is you wish to be trapped by, right? In terms of the things, the trains of thoughts that we get trapped by, right? Be careful about what you decide your mind is going to be preoccupied with, in terms of giving you anxiety, right? Because some anxiety is actually a good thing to have, right? If it's the right kind of anxiety about the right things. And it's a similar kind of analogous thing here, because, that lecture, for me at least, very much changed my perspective of meditating, or at least what I do with the information that I get out of meditating, right? Which is that discernment, right? And I think me and you, like, even rehashed some issue I had with work, where I was very much, double-minded about how to proceed, and that I meditated on it, and then I decided, I'm going to go and fight, with my boss, about something that I wasn't happy about, right? Not just like meditate and let the negative feelings wash away to whatever, right? But actually put up a fight,
exactly
because the negative feelings were actually signaling something that was important to me. And in a similar way, if you were to think about bringing wisdom or discernment, right, to the spirit of agape, right? Like, again, I don't think you've entirely convinced me of your view, but if you were to synthesize our views together, perhaps the way I would change it is that, I will go forth in the world with a heart full of compassion, kindness, and love for all people, right? And I will wish good onto humanity, and I wish humanity thrives, and I wish everyone around me thrive. But if somebody treats me in a manner that I don't think is correct, then I not that I suspend compassion or love or anything like that, or not that I say this person is unworthy of my compassion or love, because that is the road to non-personhood, right? Looking at someone as a non-person, that is a road to violence, right, and self-destruction also. But to be extremely discerning about how much of a fight I put up? How much resistance do I put up? And even the manner in which I do that resistance, right? Do I fully engage?
Sure. Yeah.
Do I fully engage, or does this person who treats me badly, is he just a non-consequential person in my life, and it doesn't even matter, like engaging with them? And that's all discernment, right? And that's the heart of wisdom, and that's why it's so difficult, right? Because all situations are unique, and they all have their own trade-offs. If you choose one action versus the other, and you're trying to, like you said, come to an optimal grip about what is the best posture to take. But if that posture is informed with a spirit of unconditional love, right? Not that it is limited by it, not that it is chained down by it, or even made to do things that are foolish because of it, right? But to be fully informed by it, to know that is, that should be sort of your North Star, right? But that doesn't mean that you be a pushover. That doesn't mean you let people take advantage of you. That doesn't mean you don't continue to set expectations to other people, right?
Yeah.
And that's where discernment comes in, right?
I'm reminded actually of a quote that, no, not at all. Talking about, again, I my argument was that the reason Paul was struggling is he was not uniting these things, right? And was viewing them as opposed in some way, or paradoxical in some way. And one of my favorite quotes from Spirituality of Imperfection is that paradox is the truth standing on her head to get attention. And
nice.
It strikes me here as this same idea, right? Is that there is this, we perceive this tension, right? And yet when we find the wise way of being, right? My contention is that we are able to resolve that tension and realize that it's one thing, that, hey, whatever, like the core thing of seeing you as a person implies all of it, and implies a balance between all of it. And sorry, I'm pulling from multiple sources here, but are you familiar? We haven't gotten deeply into Kant, but Kant, in his Groundwork for the Metaphysical Morals, proposes 6 versions of what he calls a universal moral law, right? One version of which is that any moral agent, which he defined anybody as capable of reason, right, cannot be treated as only a means to an end, but must also be considered as an end in themselves.
Yeah, humanity as an end to itself, right?
And that notion of like looking at, and we violate this all the time to some degree, right? We treat the checkout, person at the cashier, as a means to an end, right? But just that moment of engaging with them, this is a person, right? And a lot of that is seeing them as a person, is treating them as, now maybe it's nothing more than a genuine hello, right? It's not like it's not like the situation demands more of you than that.
Right.
But there's a genuineness and an authenticity to that creates a tremendous moral transformation.
Yeah, that's a very actually that is a great example. The checkout person. Who do you think about less as a person than the person who's just scanning barcodes, right? And then you give them money, and then you get your groceries. You literally don't maybe even talk to them at all, right?
Yeah.
Or say hello, even though they're like touching your stuff, right? The stuff you're going to put in your body later on, right? If you're thinking about coming up with agapic practices, right? The simple ones, right? A simple one would be, they all have name tags, these cashiers, right? Is to call them by their name as you're checking out and say, hey, whatever, Greg, how are you doing today? Or whatever it is, right? Or I like your hair or whatever, right? Simply so you can, they can for one moment be seen as a person.
I mean, because you think about that. I think about this all the time, or not all the time, but I think that person has a whole life, man.
Right.
They go home and they have struggles and, dating issues and, who knows, parent issues and children issues. And I mean, it's a full fleshed out person. And my contact with them is this thin surface of I need you to mechanically scan these barcodes, right? And push the buttons on the machine. and I'm treating you basically as a robot, not a person, right? And that's not true. It's a denial of reality. The reality is you are a person.
I mean, it's dehumanizing, right, in some sense, right? And that's, again, bringing it back to sort of the meaning crisis. So many of our professions and jobs, because we are placed into the context of a larger system where what we're doing is very systematized and proceduralized, and anybody could do it, right? Your uniqueness has no bearing on this job at all. You're not,
Yes.
It doesn't matter like how creative you are, if you're a cashier, you could be Mozart, right? And it wouldn't matter, right, to your job as a cashier.
Yeah,
right?
exactly right.
And that there's
I mean,
dehumanizing
Einstein was a
element.
Swiss patent clerk, right? Like
Yeah.
genuinely, right?
Yeah.
Like,
So yeah, that there's again, it's perhaps part of the meaning crisis as well, that a lot of our jobs make us feel that way, right? At least a lot of the menial jobs, cashier perhaps is one of them.
Sure.
Perhaps physician is a bit less so, although both me and you have complained about how it is also becoming somewhat dehumanizing, right? And perhaps that's why both of us also struggle with that a lot as well, because physicians are not meant to be jobs that where the physician is just a cog in a machine, right? You're actually meant to bring some individualism. You're meant to bring your humanity to the job, right?
No,
and when
not
you
physician,
can't anymore,
provider.
a provider.
You're
And
a
when
provider.
you can't bring your humanity to the job, right? When you can't be seen as a unique human in your job, right? As a person in your job, but just an automaton, just some placeholder before we can invent the robots to do it, right? Then it's not surprising that a lot of people feel that their jobs are also meaningless, right? Because they're not humans in their job.
Of course.
They're just automatons.
Yeah, exactly right. And I mean, okay, we'll take our job, right? Because as you said, theoretically, I think a lot of people look at a physician's job and say, "Oh, this should not be dehumanizing," right? And I think one of the things we struggle with, just as an example, you've gone to a place, a new job, where the quality of your care is appreciated in comparison to other physicians. It's allowed to flourish because there's no team of specialists, there's no whatever, and you're not overwhelmed, right, by being asked to take on more than can be reasonably done in the time frame allotted, right? And so you're able to provide very high quality care, and that difference is appreciated and is noted and is valued and welcomed, right? If you are asked to see 25 hospitalized sick patients a day in a big institution, right? Your care quality is not going to be very different than anyone else's because you're just firing from the hip. Now, maybe there'll be marginal improvements if you've memorized more than everyone else and you happen to have more nuance in your understanding. Maybe there'll be some differences, but it won't. You'll fundamentally be reduced down to a robot, and the institution will treat you that way, right? Oh, actually, you're just another provider. You can be replaced.
I'm a spare part.
You're a spare part, right? Whereas at a smaller hospital, you're not, because people see, oh man, this guy provides really high quality care in a way that's extraordinary even among physicians. Whereas that IDOS is not able to be expressed in other, right? And so we've created institutions that dehumanize the process in the process of industrializing. They're trying to standardize the care, and as a result, it becomes inherently dehumanizing.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting how that does tie into Agape, right? Because Agape is fundamentally seeing the other person as a human, right? It's like, I see you. You're a human being. You're a person, right? And it's really interesting to note how much that matters to your own sense of self-worth, right? That you're seen for who you are by other people, right? And this is something that I talked about in the summary in the beginning, is that our sense of self really comes from the way other people see us, right? And so if people treat us with agapic, undertones, it doesn't even have to be like compassion and love and whatever. It could be that, you have some harsh maths teacher in high school who, tries really hard with you and, perhaps gives you a really hard time, but that he's doing it because he cares, right? He cares about your progress, right? And because that that's the place he's coming from, you are more tolerant of it and perhaps even welcome it, and perhaps are even grateful for it. that, yes, I know, like, I'm struggling in this subject. I thank you for your concern and help. And, that's, as long as you know that that's the energy in which, and he's not just
Totally.
like pissed off because, his wife won't sleep with him or whatever, right? And he actually,
Right.
he's actually doing it
Yeah.
because his heart's in the right place, right? It completely changes the flavor of even harshness, right? I mean, a similar example would be if you were a father, right? And your children knew that you unconditionally loved them, right? That there was no doubt in their minds that you would die for them, right? And they knew that. It was fully internalized, that
Yep.
dad loves us, and there's no doubt about that. So when dad is mad at you now because you've done something that was,
Yes.
you were rude to a person, or you were like,
Yes.
callous to that other person or whatever, then you're not going to take that as punishment, or you're not going to be resentful necessarily. I mean, if you're a good person, you shouldn't be, but you're going to take it you're going to take it from, you are perhaps more willing to take that criticism because it comes from a person who loves you agapically than
100%.
otherwise, right? Because if it was if it was some automaton robot enforcing these hierarchy of values, right, it would not land the same way, because the automaton doesn't see you as a human.
Yep.
It's incapable of it, right?
Yeah. I think that frames the connection pretty clearly. It's a fascinating.
This was a good one. I think this was a good way, because in my mind, before even this conversation, I was really having a hard time. I'm very attracted to the idea of agape, the unconditional love and compassion, but I was having a very difficult time operationalizing it, right? And now I think what I've come away with from these discussions is that even in this, you need discernment, right? You need the optimal grip, right? Just like when with meditation, you have to have discernment about what you allow your mind to be preoccupied by. You have to choose what battles you allow, what enemies you allow into your mind space, right? Because some enemies actually will make you stronger and better. And in the same way, if you're going to be practicing compassion and bringing that energy to other human beings, you have to that should still be the undertone all the time, but how that manifests needs discernment, and sometimes it doesn't look like love, right? The way we understand it today, right? Which is like, oh, everything is fine, you're perfect as you are, right?
Sure, but again, I think you in that last bit you highlighted something important, right? Is that, like, it's the genuineness and the authenticity of the regard, right? Is if you, like you said, if you know that your father loves you and would die for you, and that is authentically evident, then the other things are interpreted in that context, right? Like, there's not a question about does this person care about my well-being? Does this person, or even the teacher, actually, that was maybe even a better example, right? Is, the teacher may be harsh with you, may be grading you harshly. In my experience, that's often because the teacher sees you as a person, wants and expects better, right? Because they say, hey, you're capable of more than this. I've never met a teacher that was harsh with me that didn't have high expectations of me, and especially was not being harsh because I was slacking off below my capability. I saw them not be as harsh with other people, right? But they said, hey, you're smarter than that. Like, and that's also right. The student is not. I'm not treating my students as just automatons in the class. They're all equal. They're all interchangeable. No, this one is smarter. This one is struggling more. Is this person struggling with this subject, or are they generally just not as intelligent and need to just be a little bit gentle with the fact that, hey, we can bring you along to finish the class with a C, right? But that's my expectation of what you're capable of, versus this guy who's got an A, but I'm actually going to be harsher with that guy because he's performing below his capability, because I'm seeing them as people, right? And caring about their outcome and their well-being.
Yeah. And it is tough. I think, this is also the other struggle of wisdom, is that it isn't just a recipe book or a cookie cutter thing, and this is something that again, my background is Muslim, growing up in a very traditional Muslim environments, right? And the ethos in those countries, right? I'm talking about Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, which is as rigidly Islamic as they come, is that, there is a perfect, clear answer everywhere, right? Like to all situations, right? It's completely apparent what you should do. And if you just read the Quran or the Hadith long enough, or you speak to a cleric, they will just give you the prescriptive solution, right? And I think this is perhaps a larger point to be made, right? Is that wisdom is difficult. To be wise is always difficult, right? It's not that like there's some point in time, oh my God, I'm wise, right? Everything is now. It's like it's always a struggle, right?
It's the dukkha, right? Is being unwise is a constant threat.
Now you're rewriting.
You can. I am. No, I am. But it's a similar or an analogous concept.
No, right? but it speaks to a larger point about wisdom, right? Which I don't think until I've just said it, I've really fully internalized it, right? Because I think I'm still influenced by my childhood. As we always are, right? By the deep-seated fabric in society of this notion that what is right and what is wrong is literally black and white, and that every single social situation that you can think of has some prescription in the Quran or the Hadith or some fatwa, and the fatwa itself is of course based on Hadith and Quran. So ultimately, the books or the canon have all the answers you need, and wisdom is just looking hard enough in those books. Right? That's all that is, right?
And more than that,
for the right religious argument.
My experience of really religious people, or religious Muslims, I would say. Christians is a little different, to be honest, in my experience. But is that there's a denial of the pervasiveness of the need for interpretation, right? There's the notion that you can read something and it's clear, right? Whatever my interpretation is not actually an interpretation. It's just what the text says.
Yeah.
Right? And so it's a really interesting notion to challenge people even with these ideas like, hey, we listen to Vervaeke. Vervaeke is a very clear, thoughtful, detailed lecturer, right? And yet we are trying to struggle to interpret what did he mean, right? What is he saying? What are the implications of this, right? Let alone a book that's written often mythologically, written often, metaphorically, right? The notion that you can read that and there is a clear interpretation, right? Like it's not even an interpretation. It's just what the book says, right? Is a denial of the reality of how even language works, right? There's a philosophy of language issue there.
Of course.
But there's this desire for, I think it's motivated, in my opinion, often by a desire to not wrestle with this, is to have certainty rather than having to wrestle with how to be wise. And just whatever the thing is, I just want to be certain, because I can skip this whole thing about having to develop discernment and having to build wisdom and deal with tricky questions, right?
Yeah, I was thinking the other day, and I had the thought about how difficult wisdom was, right? That this was the central preoccupation of Socrates. Like, how do you live a good life? It's such a simple question, right? And because you have to bring wisdom to bear on that, right?
Yes.
And it's just so difficult. He was like obsessed with this problem, right? And and you'd be like, well, why is this such a big deal? But it's a big deal if you just
big deal. Yeah, absolutely.
If you forego everything is written and everything is settled, if you just throw that out the window, he exposed how erroneous a lot of our presumptions was, and then once those were exposed, then we have to think of the task of what does it mean to live a good life, right? And how do you bring wisdom to bear on the infinite number of situations you may find yourself in, and then what sort of hierarchy of how do you apply your hierarchy of values correctly to that situation, right?
Yep.
And one of the ways you could think about this is if you ever make a mistake because you didn't act wisely, not to be hard on yourself as well. You don't have a deep character flaw. You were just a person who was trying to be wise, and in that particular instant, you failed.
Yep.
And you will probably fail again, right?
Yep.
That doesn't make you like a flawed character. It just the task of knowing what the optimal grip is, what the proper discernment is extremely difficult. And knowing when and how and to what degree you should treat other people with unconditional love and compassion, it falls into the same arena of like that's a difficult thing to know in all circumstances. Right.
Yep.
And there may be some people like I could imagine like someone who just like lost their loved one. Right. In that person's case, you're not going to tell them on day 4 like, hey, have you gone to the gym today? Like your mom it's been 4 days since your mom died. Maybe you should stop eating ice cream. In that case, perhaps it's a good example of how you bring them more ice cream. You don't you don't bring them protein bars that day. You bring. I mean, that's just a silly example, right?
Yeah.
But,
No, it's a
of how it's a moving target sometimes, and it's not always clear.
And I think I think it also explains to some degree. You and I have talked about this at different times. How we have these conceptions of people like Jesus, right, who were maybe talented artists at the art of wisdom, right? Maybe something about them had a talent for finding the optimal grip in this domain, right? And that's why they were such striking characters in history that just like accomplishments in any other domain, these were the people who were the towering lights of finding the optimal grip of wisdom in this constantly shifting landscape that requires constant difficulty and constant engagement and agape and all these demands, right? And maybe there's these few towering people in history that just had the combination of talent and work to be the Kobe Bryant of wisdom.
Jesus was Kobe Bryant, basically.
Yeah.
The Kobe Bryant of wisdom.
Yeah.
All right, man. Good talk. I don't know if there's any other points you wanted to raise, but I think I got some clarity.
No, I think that's it.
Through the conversation, for sure.
Phenomenal, right, man. Looking forward to 17.
Absolutely. See you soon.